All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we have something that is really a real special treat. It's something that I haven't done in a while in terms of my Shroud Wars formats. It's a real head-on debate, one-on-one between Jack Markwardt, representing the Pro-Shroud side. Hey, Jack.
Good morning, Dale.
Welcome back. Welcome back. And as everyone's favorite Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. Hey, Hugh, how's it going?
Fine, and good afternoon from the UK.
Yes. It's you guys are 5 hours ahead there or something. So, all right, cool. And also, by popular demand, we have Teddy Pappas returning as a cross-examiner. So, hey, Teddy.
Hello, how are y'all?
Excellent. All right, cool. So,
Morning, Ted.
awesome. So today's plan, if you heard my Shroud panel review show part 4, both Jack and Hugh were on that show, and I offered to bring them back if they had something that they really wanted to go over in more detail. And at that point, Jack kind of said, well, I really want to tackle Hugh on the medieval documents. I think there's a lot more to be said that has been covered in other Shroud shows, not just mine, but anywhere else on the internet. So I think it's really important. Yeah, let's have a one-on-one, full-on discussion and debate about this topic in particular. And that's the plan for today. So basically, the format will just be, I'm going to give both Jack and Hugh their uninterrupted 10-minute openings or so to give their case. Then after that, I'm going to devote half an hour to each person. So I'll hand it to, Jack first to grill Hugh for a whole half an hour and talk to him. Then half an hour for Hugh to grill Jack. And then after my informal discussion period, and then after that, this is where Teddy comes in as a cross-examiner. She'll be given about between 10 to 15 minutes to kind of cross-examine both of the participants. So that's the plan for today. But yeah, with that said, I think we should just get straight into it. And I think I'll start with Hugh first this time. Usually he waits till last. So Hugh, if you want to give your kind of 10-minute or less opening statement.
Right, thank you. Yes. I began one of my papers by saying that the first reference we have to the Shroud in France is a bull by Clement VII, dated June 1389, in which he requests that the object, which is a representation of the Shroud, may be exhibited, but it must be exhibited under the proviso that it is announced in a loud, clear voice that it is not the Shroud of our Lord. And also, I've got it here, that none of the usual trappings due to a holy object may surround it. No capes, vestments, or any unusual lighting, by which I imagine that most churches were fairly gloomy and lit by a small amount of candles, but relics could be lit by large candles and much panoply, but they weren't going to have any of that. And that was written by Clement VII, I think, in June 1389, and he reiterated it a little later, and he also sent a similar message to all the churches round about, saying that the what do we call it? Figuram sive representationem must be declared not to be the true Shroud of Christ, and it may not have any of the panoply round about, and that it was the duty of all the churches round about to go and check that this was actually happening. Then, as far as I can see, if that was in June, it's generally thought that D'Arcy wrote his memorandum towards the end of 1389 or the beginning of 1390. So Clement made all his instructions before D'Arcy wrote the memorandum. So it's not particularly relevant to Clement's instructions whether D'Arcy sent his memorandum or not. There is some doubt about whether he was in a rage and rushed it, got it all copied out and then thought better of it and decided not to send it at all. Doesn't really matter. Clement operated without any reference to that particular statement, as far as I know. Then the D'Arcy's chief problem was that Geoffrey II was exhibiting the shroud, and as far as we could see, he stated, Geoffrey II stated that the shroud was not the true shroud of Christ, exactly as the Pope had insisted. And D'Arcy was furious that nevertheless it was privately put about that it was the true shroud of Christ, and he wanted the whole thing suppressed, which of course the Pope refused to do because he'd already said that it could be exhibited. Nevertheless, after a while, the shroud stopped being exhibited, and the next thing we hear about it is in 1415, 1618, something like that, when the Dean and Chapter of Leary ask Humbert de Villesexel to look after their sheet on which is a representation of the shroud. What have they got here? I've got it in wonderful medieval French. I think it's a drap, on which is the figure or representation of the shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ, but in medieval French. So where we want to know, does anybody claim that it is the true shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ? And as far as I can see, the first time we come across this is in about 1472 or something like that, when it's actually when the new Dean of Leary is trying to get it back, and presumably the new Dean of Leary is trying to get it back because now that it's been touted around, possibly under the grounds that it is the real shroud, they think, well, in that case, we could have made more money out of it than we actually have done. And so he's saying, okay, I'll take your word for it. Let's have it back. But of course, Margaret won't give it to them. I'll just sort of add on to this because we're discussing the whole set of documents that there are. We find that Margaret is excommunicated for not returning the shroud to the Dean and Chapter of Leary. Well, now, if it was accepted that Margaret was in fact the true owner of the shroud, why on earth should she be excommunicated for not giving it back to the chapel? That seems to me an interesting point, and I don't really know what the answer is. We do, of course, going back to it, we don't really know about the adventures of the shroud prior to the 1480s, except insofar as D'Arcy tells us that the Dean and Chapter of Leary started exhibiting it, and that Henry de Poitiers immediately squashed it. Now, of course, we may look at Henry de Poitiers. Am I going on for too long? We can look at all Henry de Poitiers' documents that we've got. Stop shortly before the Battle of Poitiers, and it's my contention that the shroud wasn't exhibited in Leary until after the Battle of Poitiers. I think that's probably enough to be going on with.
Awesome. Okay, cool. And yeah, you still had 4 minutes left, so you were good in terms of time.
Oh, well, I thought I might be overrunning.
No, you were good. All right, cool. So at this point, I'm going to turn it straight to Jack to give, on the Pro-Shroud side, give his case. And Jack, I know you sent me slides, so do you want me to share it now, or do you want me to just wait?
No, I think that maybe as it comes up, if it's okay, I'll just designate what the slide is.
Okay.
That's pertinent at that time.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Go.
So anyway, I come at this a little bit differently than Hugh does. I think maybe it's my experience as an attorney over 40 some years. And I'm not going to come into this by going right into the evidence. I think that this takes kind of a broader view so that people can understand what we're talking about here. You know, the history of the shroud is in various segments, and the way that I see this discussion is on the kind of very narrow segment of the history of the shroud, starting in the 1350s. And primarily going through 1390 when these documents are all issued. I do want to say something about some of the comments that Hugh has made, because I think it's better. I'm kind of a stickler for the detail, as I know he would like to be. The bull that was issued was by Clement is July the 28th of 1389. We don't have that bull as far as I know. I don't think that has survived. I think what we know about it in that bull is in a letter that Clement wrote to Geoffrey de Charny II at that time, which was a custom of what popes would do. If they would put out a bull, they would then write letters to the people that it primarily affected and then tell them what was in the bull. The second thing that I would want to correct, or at least have a counter opinion on, is that the memo of D'Arcy is probably written in August of 1389. That is, it does post-date the bull. But if you look at D'Arcy's memo, you can see that he's reciting historical events, things that have happened. And the last event that he refers to is an event on August 5th, when the king sends a bailee out to, or dispatches a bailee to seize the shroud. And he doesn't mention any events after that, even though there's an event on August the 15th where the bailee actually goes out there and they have kind of a to-do over at the Leary Church. The third thing that I thought was a bit of a misstatement on Hugh's part was that Clement did not, in his July bull, tell the Leary clergy to refer to this as a figure or representation. He simply says in the bull that Geoffrey wants to put a figure and representation of the church. And this is what ends up causing the problem that develops after that, that without that specific instruction, the Leary clergy begins to treat the shroud as a genuine relic with some of their ceremonials and such. And it's the bull of January 6th of 1390 that actually has these restrictions in it that Hugh has referred to. And I think to understand the history, you do have to make sure you have these events in order, and you know what is being said at every stage. So I would agree with you that the Pope does not know about the D'Arcy Memorandum when he puts out the first bull. But I think the long-running dispute is whether the Pope ever knows what's in the D'Arcy Memorandum when he puts out his second bull. Also, I did look at the previous show, and I've seen some of the positions that Hugh has taken with regard to that. I noticed that he doesn't say two things that are very important. I think we'll get into this when we actually talk about the documents. But the bull of July 28th of 1389 was issued ex certa scientia by the Pope. And I haven't heard that brought up, and I think it's a significant fact, because it means that the Pope says, I'm going to put something in this bull, but I want everyone to know that I'm issuing this bull out of knowledge which I have, out of certain knowledge which I have, and out of discretion for some reason that would benefit the church or the faith. I'm not going to tell you what that knowledge is that I have. So you don't get everything of what is happening out of the papers themselves. And secondly, when Clement issues the second bull of January 6th, and I haven't heard Hugh mention this, there's a preamble to the bull. And in that preamble, Clement says, I'm going to tell you why I'm issuing this particular bull. He gets a little vague, but he says sometimes, and when we get to the actual documents, I'll have Dale put it up, but he says sometimes things happen in the times. There's a change of times and there's a change of circumstances, and the Holy See has to change something that it's done before. So this is why I'm doing this at this time. And so as historians, we have to try to find out what changed between July of 1389 and January of 1390. What was it that changed that made Clement go from what he originally said to what he said in January? And I think I know the answer to that, and I'm going to put that forward when we get to that. But again, I just think it's very important that if we're going to approach the subject just by grabbing documents and pulling things out of the documents and then giving personal opinions on what they are and what they say and what they mean, I think we have a great challenge ahead of us. But fortunately, we don't really have to do that, I don't think. History needs to be considered in context. And what I've always found deficient in a lot of historical writings, and particularly involving the Shroud, is just a lack of historical context. And in this age, for example, the church, these are all documents that we're going to be talking about. These are all ecclesiastical documents. They're written by a pope or they're written by a bishop, every single one. And so this controversy involves a relic. It's a relic being displayed in a Catholic church. And so the most significant factor that backs this all up is ecclesiastical history, church history. What is going on in church history at that time? That's what we need to know in order to know what is motivating Pope Innocent VI in the 1350s and anti-Pope Clement VII in the 1390s. That is what is motivating Bishop Henry when he writes letters. That's what's motivating a papal curia in 1357 when they issue a bull that hasn't been mentioned in this discussion, but it's very, very significant to what is going on historically. I think the other thing that I would like to kind of mention here in my opening is that we have to put this kind of in factual context as well. And that is that from the standpoint, I think, of most authenticists, in fact, as far as I know, all authenticists, we identify the Turin Shroud with the Shroud of Constantinople. And quite briefly, that is a sindon. It's called a sindon, so it's a burial cloth. It's made of linen. It has a full figure of Jesus Christ on it. And all we really know about it is that it was exhibited in Constantinople in the period of 1203-1204. We have a historical record that says that transpired, and then it supposedly disappeared in some way. And there are more than a few opinions on what happened to it in the so-called missing years. But the important thing is that when the Shroud appears in their right in 1350s, the Pope at that time and the bishops at that time know that there is a Shroud from 1204 that has disappeared. When Geoffrey shows up at some point and says, I own the Shroud, there's a Shroud in Liray, they don't say, where does this come from? This is out of somebody's imagination. This is some artist who had a very clever idea and put this figure on a cloth. They're Catholics. They're looking at things from a faith-based point of view. And they're saying, could this be, or should this be, the Shroud that was the Byzantine relic that was exhibited back in 1204? And now it's come here. And so what would the Pope do at that time? Of course, he would have to talk to Geoffrey de Charnay, and de Charnay would have to give him the reasons of why he has the Shroud, how it came to him. These are all the things that happened before these documents were written. And I kind of see what happens a lot of times in Shroud history is it's like taking a college course, and it's a college course, it's kind of an overview, and people are always talking about the overview, and you come out of that course and you have a general idea what happened in the history of the United States or England or Germany, but you won't really have a detailed knowledge of the Civil War, World War II. For those, you need to go take courses on those particular subjects. And this period in Shroud history, say between roughly 1350 and 1390, that's a period in and of itself. For authenticists, it's just the continuation of what we have said happened with the Shroud, And the last time we could pick it up for sure was in Constantinople, but this is a continuation of this. And non-authenticists, which I think Hugh has indicated he likes to be called, non-authenticists, they really don't have to be bothered too much with the pre-Leray history, because they come from science world. They're not coming from history world. And they're over there and they're saying, hey, we've got the scientific test that said the shroud didn't exist till at least 1260. So we don't really care what, the authenticists are saying happened to the shroud in 1204. But this is the first time, this period that we're going into, that the non-authenticists have some kind of burden of proof to sustain, because they are saying that the shroud existed at this time. I know when we get through this topic, and even though Hugh raised some very good questions last time, that I don't think he seriously disputes that the shroud was exhibited in Leray in the 1350s. Now, if that's the case, what is the history of the shroud from a non-authenticist point of view, from the time that it was created to the time that it was shown in Leary? This is a history exercise that we're doing. And it's easy enough for me, and most authenticists, I say the shroud showed up in Leary because Geoffrey de Charnay was its owner and he went to Leary. So he took his property with him. We don't have to say, what is the shroud doing in some backwoods village of France in the 1350s? However, the non-authenticists say that somebody went out and took a cloth that's no older than 1260, put an image on that cloth, and brought it to Leray. We wouldn't have to worry if this showed up in Paris. And we could say, well, somebody who was rich enough to buy the cloth and rich enough to have somebody put this awesome image on it in some unknown way.
So, Jack, just so you know, we're at the 10:30 thing. So just wrap up what you're saying, and then we'll go to the next portion.
Okay, yeah, I was pretty much there, except that I do think that what I haven't heard from Hugh, and I'm sure we'll hear it today, is how did the shroud then go to Leray? And the only explanation I've ever heard is that Dean Robert D. Calac, the Dean of Leary, acquired it without really any kind of explanation of how he acquired it, when he acquired it, how the value that the cloth must have had, either as a real relic or a fake relic that could attract people to churches. Where did D. Calac get the money to bring the shroud to Leray? I think we have to kind of set that table before we get to the documents that then purport to tell us what happened in Leray in the 1350s and thereafter.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. So, all right, cool. So at this point, we come to the part that I know Jack is really looking forward to. So this is kind of the Q&A cross-examine. So I started with Hugh in the openings. Jack, I'll start with you here. You get half an hour to kind of grill Hugh point by point or whatever you want to do.
Okay, well, this is kind of a grab bag this way, but let me start, Hugh, with what I just said. Could you explain to me the non-authenticist point of view, the history of the Turin Shroud from the time that it was created, with as much specificity as you can give, to the time that it appears in Leray for exhibition?
Yep. From our point of view, it is total supposition. But I think it's sensible supposition, and I'll explain. Well, you'll understand why it's a sensible supposition, even if you disagree with it. I've got no history like Robert de Clary, who says he saw an image of. Well, no, who says that he has knowledge of an image.
There, yeah, it was there.
Up and down. However, this is the non-authenticist position, if you like, and that is the Quem Quaeritis ceremony, of which you will be familiar because it was enacted first of all on Easter Sunday and later on Corpus Christi as well, the Feast of Corpus Christi. After that was instituted, it was enacted in literally thousands of churches, literally all over Europe. Now, we know that because it's found in the use of Hereford, it's found in the use of Sarum, it's found in missals and books of liturgy all over Europe, and I forget his name, but a wonderful German wrote a 7-volume book tabulating 400 or 500 different versions of the Quem Quaeritis liturgy, which he picked up from medieval manuscripts all over Europe. It's in one of my books, and I can find it out later. So we know that this ceremony was enacted. It was enacted in churches, big ones and small ones, all over the place. It involved an Easter sepulchre, which was either a wooden box which you could bring out for the occasion, or right up to something that was built into the wall of the church. And of course, those medieval churches which still remain, a lot of them still have them. You can see the Easter sepulchres built into the side of the church. So the ceremony definitely existed. Now, in a fair proportion of those liturgies, the 3 clerics dressed as holy women, funnily enough, go across to the Easter sepulchre, where they meet another cleric who's dressed as an angel, and the angel that they are, the angel says, "Quem quaeritis?" Who are you looking for? They say, "We're looking for Jesus." The angel says he's not here, but here is his shroud, normally written as a lintamina, and the clerics then take that to the high altar and display it to the congregation, or if it's a monastery, they display it to the monks. So all over Europe, there were shrouds. That's, I think, fairly incontestable. What we don't know, of course, is what they look like or whether they had anything on them. None of these shrouds exist, except possibly the shroud of Besançon, which was destroyed in the French Revolution, and possibly the shroud of Turin, which is what I maintain. So I think that this the shroud was made. It's an expensive piece of material. It's a huge piece of material. So it wasn't made for display in a village church. It was made for display in either an abbey or a cathedral. I've no idea which abbey and which cathedral, I'm afraid, but that's the possibility that I'm aiming for. Now, for one reason or another, it was discontinued. One reason may have been that it got terribly stained. One reason may have been that they got dirty and they washed it and the image practically disappeared. All these are speculation, which I won't go further into, but there are reasons for it. It was then given to somebody else. Now, it might have been given to Geoffrey de Charny, or it might have been given to the Dean of Leary. Either of them knew exactly what it was. It was an old shroud that had been used for the Quem Quaeritis ceremony in a large cathedral. It might have been Melun Cathedral. It might even have been a Carthusian abbey, not far away from Troy itself. The name of the abbey escapes me at the moment. Was it Melun? There's another one. Anyway, but there are various possibilities. But so the shroud came into their possession. Of course, they knew exactly what it was. Geoffrey de Charny certainly would not have exhibited it as the proper shroud, because he was a gallant and noble knight. But after he died, I think, then the dean said, "Well, we've got this thing. Let's see if we can exhibit it and announce that it's the shroud." So that would be my backstory to it.
Yeah, and the way I react to that is that I think it took you probably 10 minutes to explain a history that should otherwise be very, very compact, and it's just filled with ambiguities about it. You don't know whether Geoffrey de Charny got it. You don't say why he would have obtained it. I didn't hear you say that in the ceremonies that you're describing, there's a single one that uses a image shroud of any kind, or that an image shroud was the tradition of these particular ceremonies. This kind of sounds like Charles Freeman rebaked in some way, that, this is the story that's there. And, I want to emphasize that I think that on the science side of things, that the laboring order is now in the hands of the authenticists. I mean, we've got, some ways to go to kind of explain that test and what happened in the test. But on the historical side, when you get to Leary in the 1350s, I think it's far more plausible, but that will be a matter of opinion, that this shroud came to Geoffrey de Charnay sometime in his lifetime. And he was born around 1300, so he had 50 years to acquire the shroud. We've got 13 hypotheses of how he came to the shroud, and most of them involve inheritance, gifts, awards, not purchase, and that he's the person that founded Leary, founded the Leary Church, and that is why the shroud is there. The rest of this, as you say, compared to that, is much more speculative, and I just don't think, that it's credible in that way. The other part of the story, which, again, I hope we get to when we get to the documents, but because you brought it up, is what do you have, what do you have as a non-authenticist that says that these exhibitions which took place after Geoffrey's death? That fits your story very well. And it's, by the way, it's a story, I've been involved with this for 35 years. And for 30 of those years, the general presumption was that the shroud was exhibited by and at the will of Geoffrey de Charnay. And then with one exception, and that was Ian Wilson, he could not figure out why Geoffrey was silent about owning the shroud. And he struggled with that over a number of writings that he had, some of them in your journal, the British Journal. And so he switched over. In the course of 40 years, he had 4 different versions of what transpired. It was the wife, Geoffrey's widow, who exhibited. No, it was Geoffrey that exhibited. No, it was the dean in conjunction with the wife who exhibited. And I think the last repeat of this was it was the dean. But there's nothing that indicates that, even in D'Arcy's memorandum. When you get to that, D'Arcy does not say when this happened. Even his claim that the dean acquired the cloth and exhibited it, he doesn't say when that happened. And there's a major, again, historical context difficulty with that sort of proffer that you're making on that. And that is when Geoffrey de Charnay died at battle on September the 18th of 1356, what went with him was the 2,500 of the finest knights in France. It was a 13,000 French army that got defeated. Many of them were killed. The king was taken captive and was brought to England. And historians say that France then went into near anarchy. They didn't have the army, they didn't have the leadership, and what's documented historically is that there were brigands, mainly consisting of English soldiers from the battle and from Gascony, Navarrese from Gascony, and they were roaming the French countryside and they were raiding things. Now, you would have historically these exhibitions being started in the middle of this anarchy at the end of 1356 and into 1357. That's when you would have this. You would also have it happen at a time that, and I'm sure we'll get to this, we better get to it, but where there's a church canon 62 that says you can't do this without the approval of the Pope. So either this cleric has gone to the Pope in some way, that's going to take time, or he's doing it in violation of the canon at that time. And then you have to have the rest of D'Arcy's story happen. There's got to be enough exhibitions that Bishop Henry gets irritated or concerned about what is happening. He's got to commence an investigation. He's got to find an artist who confesses to having painted the image on the shroud. He's then got to convene a council of wise men of the law and theologians, and then he has to start proceedings against the dean for the dean to be fearful enough to take the relic and hide it. And this really all has to happen in the midst of all this anarchy that is happening, and probably be completed by June the 5th of 1357. Why that date? Well, there's another document here that is rarely mentioned. I'm going to guess, Hugh, that you probably are at least aware of it. And that is that on June the 5th of 1357, a pontifical curia connected with the Pope in Avignon issues a pontifical bull. And in that bull, they deal with Leray, and they grant to Leray all these extended indulgences, which really, I don't want to digress into this now, but it kind of puts the lie to everything that D'Arcy has said, because all these things were happening, you would not have this pontifical curia giving increased indulgences to Leray. But they say that one of the ways that the visitors to the church at Leray can earn these indulgences is to visit the relics, plural. It says nothing about the Turin Shroud. It doesn't say to visit the great shroud that's there or the shroud that has been exhibited. So it's fairly well clear that whenever the shroud was there, at whatever time it was exhibited, it was not there as of June of 1357. And yet you would have all these things happen somewhere between Geoffrey's death in September of 1356 and this pontifical bull in June of 57. And those things just could not have happened that way. Nor, if you believe D'Arcy, could there be pilgrims coming from all around the world to visit Leray and go back to their countries while the countryside is being raided and the French government cannot provide safety to these pilgrims that are coming. So that's where I think that the historical context of what happened in Leray, I really wonder, I mean, seriously, I know that you're arguing a non-authenticist case here, but do you seriously believe that the scenario laid out in which the exhibitions don't take place until after Geoffrey's death, and it's the dean that's involved in that, rather than they took place 2 years earlier and they're orchestrated or at least approved by Geoffrey? Do you think that second scenario, the later scenario, actually has more plausibility than the former?
That's a very good point. No, I think I think it's possible now. I think you're quite likely correct that the shroud was exhibited before the Battle of Poitiers. But that still, to me, it doesn't necessarily mean that Geoffrey de Charny was there. Obviously, he was off fighting his.
Yes.
But I don't see it being exhibited much before 1356. I certainly wouldn't see it being exhibited in 1350.
Why wouldn't you see it being exhibited? You know, what we do know from the historical records, from the papal records, is that they were locked and loaded to do the shroud expositions as of October the 16th of 1354. That is when Geoffrey de Charny had chosen his 6 canons, and they had elected the Leray dean, and all the preliminaries were in place. So you wouldn't have had the expositions unless the canons were there to be able to run them. So they're in place by 1354. Why the assertion, I don't think it took place till 1356? Why couldn't they have taken place in 1354, 1355? And by the way, if they had taken place in 1355, you'd be right on the money with what D'Arcy said. He said this happened about 34 years ago, give or take. Yep. But that's the date that he picked. That would be 1355. Geoffrey would be alive. He might not be there on a regular basis. He has to run up to northwest France and watch what's happening there. But sometimes these statements are made, and I just look at them and say, I don't know, but I don't think that you could say that there'd be any valid reason for saying that the exhibitions took place in 1356. And now, if you are somewhat agreeing that they may not have taken place after Geoffrey's death, well, then why do they have to take place in 1356? I think I know your reason, because you're troubled. I think you said in your last show when you talked about this, you're worried about the significance of Bishop Henry's letter in May of 1356, in which he's praising the divine cult that is at Liray. And whether or not it's just a letter that says to Geoffrey, "You go, boy, we like what you're doing there," or it has the significance that I think it has, and that is, it's in referring to the divine cult, it's referring to the cult of pilgrims who are coming to Liray and have been coming to Liray to venerate the shroud. But whatever the case, that basically says Henry's he didn't conduct an investigation before that, and he's not likely to conduct an investigation after that. But if he does, it must have to be after Geoffrey has passed away. That's where I think the non-authenticists are kind of in this corner. And I think their story would be a lot better if they would just kind of forget about the D'Arcy Memorandum, because the D'Arcy Memorandum doesn't really make a lot of historical sense given what the historical circumstances are at the time. I could buy it myself personally if the story was that, and you'll probably use this in the future, but if the story was that Geoffrey got busy with the war after 1354, and that's when the dean kind of took over, and he had those exhibitions in Geoffrey's absence. But what would kill that, why you can't go there, I think, is because then if Bishop D'Arcy got upset about it over that period of time, he wouldn't be writing that letter of praise at the end of May. So it's kind of a conundrum that I think that non-authenticists have about the very beginning of the history of the shroud, when they finally admit the shroud exists, that authenticists don't have. Our story is rather simple. We used to have a show here in the United States that was called The Tonight Show way back when, and Johnny Carson would always say, if you buy the premise, you'll buy the bit. And there's just a false premise here. If you buy the authenticist premise that Geoffrey de Charnay is the owner of the shroud, got his church ready for exhibitions, and was ready to go in 1354, and the exhibitions took place over the next couple years, and there were no problems with them, and that's why the Bishop Henry praised them, praised Geoffrey, and praised the cult that was going on. This all makes historical sense. But it kind of then puts, and when I say puts the lie to the D'Arcy Memorandum, I'm not trying to indicate that D'Arcy lied necessarily. I just think it was a bunch of poor information that he had, that now that we're studying it, it just doesn't make very much sense in historical context.
Yeah, you make some good points. The reason why I'm hesitant to involve Geoffrey the First in the exhibition is because D'Arcy doesn't mention him. D'Arcy had no particular affection for the de Charny family, as you can tell from his argument against Geoffrey II. But he doesn't say that it was Geoffrey the First who produced this image. He says it was the Dean and Chapter of Liray.
Yeah, but everything he's going to say about what happened there, Hugh, is negative. He's going to say that for his story to make sense, and remember why he's writing this memo that I don't think he ever sends to the Pope, but why he's putting down these thoughts. He's trying to stop the exhibitions. So his goal here is to make the shroud unseemly and the history of the shroud unseemly. So he has to say, this is what's going on in Liray. Somebody got a false relic. They knew it was a false relic. They wanted to make money from it. Then they put on these charades during the exhibitions where people were pretending to be healed. And actually then an artist was found who admitted to having painted the cloth. Now, how do you say that about Geoffrey de Charnay I? He's the greatest hero at that time in France. He's died at the side of the king. carrying the oriflamme with him. And he's one of the most respected men, and his family still survives. His son is there, and they've got connections. The Charnay family has connections to the Pope at that time. You know, Geoffrey Charnay II is the nephew of or by marriage, I think, of the Pope. So why would you be surprised that D'Arcy didn't mention Geoffrey de Charnay in connection with a scandalous account that he is giving concerning what happened at Charney's church?
Because he has no compunction about impugning de Charnay's son. It's obvious.
Charney's son was 3 years old at that time. He's not imputing. It's one thing to take some, at that point, low-level Charney knight versus Geoffrey Charnay, who was on the King's Council, the bearer of the oriflamme, and a hero at Poitiers. And he's going to, 35 years after the fact, make these allegations and say Geoffrey knew of them, he was a part of them. He's going to leave the Charnay family out of it. He's not even really attacking Geoffrey.
But he doesn't leave the de Charnay family out of it. His whole point is that the young de Charnay is exhibiting the shroud in a fraudulent manner. So
why does he do? He's not saying that Geoffrey Jr., Geoffrey II, is exhibiting the shroud in a fraudulent manner. He is saying the shroud is fraudulent. You know, his argument is that there cannot be, through the gospel accounts, there cannot be a shroud of this kind. And Geoffrey, apparently, we don't know what the source is, but Geoffrey apparently told the bishop's legate in France that this is a representation or figure of the shroud, precisely so he doesn't have to get into the controversy of whether it's real. And he's just showing the shroud. He's not saying Geoffrey II's making any money from it, or there's not. I don't think you can fairly read D'Arcy's memorandum and look at it as an attack on the Charnay family. And I think that is the reason why. And it could very well be that D'Arcy doesn't know. It's 35 years after the fact. But if he does know that Geoffrey de Charnay was alive at that time, that he's not going to mention him, and he doesn't want to connect him to the scandal that he's trying to create through his memo. It's that simple.
Yeah, well, it's simple enough, but I don't buy it. I think we'll just have to differ on this one. De Charnay had no qualms at all about saying that the young D'Arcy had no qualms at all in saying that the young de Charnay was a villain, and that's what he specifically says in his memorandum. He might have decided not to send it, but if he's decided that the son was being duplicitous, then I don't see why he would have had any qualms at all at saying that the father was also the duplicitous. Perhaps he would have toned down the instructions. Now, you've sort of built up de Charnay I as being an enormously famous and celebrated knight that no one could possibly say anything against. On the other hand, de Charnay II is a miserable and insignificant person who it doesn't matter what you say about him. But I think in those days that the father and the son relationship were extremely important. You couldn't impugn the son without impugning the father.
I think even in those days, some excellent parents had some pretty bad children, and people understood that. So I think people could understand that. But I don't, not to harp on this too much, but I just think if you read the D'Arcy Memorandum, it's not really that much of a diatribe against Geoffrey II. In fact, it would be somewhat absurd, because his complaints about Geoffrey II is that Geoffrey may have told the legate or the Pope a false story about what happened back in the 1350s. But Geoffrey at that time was 2 or 3 years old. It's obvious that he did not know what happened personally at that time. And whatever he's saying what he was told. And another fact that's hardly ever brought out about this period, the second period where the D'Arcy Memorandum is written, is that Geoffrey's widow is still alive. She lives until, I think it's 1424. But she was a very, very young girl when she married Geoffrey. She was probably only 17 or 18 years old at the time. And so she's around. Now, she lived some of these events. Geoffrey may or may not have told her what the background of the history of the shroud was as he knew it. I don't think he did. but she was certainly there in the village of Lyrae when these events were happening. She knows who exhibited the shroud. She would know whether it was obtained by the dean or obtained by her husband. She would know whether or not there were any threats made against the Lyrae dean for showing it, and she would certainly know what happened with the shroud after it transpired. And that kind of brings us to one other thing about the D'Arcy Memorandum. He ends it by saying that the dean took the shroud and he hid it for 34 years. Or the canons hid it for 34 years.
Yeah, well, it was anyway. Yeah.
And yet, it is Geoffrey de Charnay II who brings the shroud forward for the second set of exhibitions. And even, I guess, the most notable non-authenticist historian, Andrea Nicolati, he says that he thinks that during this interim period between the two sets of exhibitions, that the shroud was in Charney hands. It was taken to Charney lands. I mean, again, it's one of those things like, how far can D'Arcy go? How far does he have to go? Why does he say that the shroud was taken by the dean and the canons have hid it for 34 years? How is he going to prove that if Geoffrey de Charnay says, I didn't get it from the canons, I got it from my mother? And any fair historian, even a non-authenticist, is looking at the history here and saying, in all likelihood, it was kept by the Charney family during this period of time. So again, the story that is told in the allegations that are made, and I noticed that you said this in the earlier program, I mean, some of them are very, very weak. Some of them are very, very questionable. And I don't think it really, maybe, I think you said, Hugh, that the D'Arcy Memorandum is not as important as it used to be. And back in 1900, it was a very important thing because we didn't have carbon testing. And so the idea that somebody finds this document and a bishop at that time said all these things about the shroud that were of a negative nature, that kind of carried the story for, a good 78 years, at least until Stirk came along. But I don't think it really means that much today.
All right, cool. So
yeah, I think the papal bulls of Clement VII are the critical thing, and the fact that the shroud is never, well, it is only once in all that time referred to, or do we think that it was considered genuine?
No, I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll finish off this point. So, Hugh, finish your point. This is Jack's time, so I'll let him get the last word if he wants it. But then after that, I want to switch it to Hugh having the reins, and he controls the show to question Jack. So,
okay, I'll mention the next bit later. Yeah.
Yes. Well,
so when you said that D'Arcy wasn't an out-and-out liar, you've then said that he suppressed this. This wasn't the case. So was he telling which bits of what he said were not true? Do you think? Okay.
If I could do this, Hugh, as I answer this, let me just go through this. That's the question that you asked in the last program, and you threw down the gauntlet, and I didn't see anybody pick it up. It kind of went on to he didn't tell the truth about it being a painting. It turned into a scientific discussion about the painting. So I wonder, Dan, if you could, on the slides that I sent you, let me go to the slides here. If you go to the slide in which I start listing D'Arcy's allegations, I think that would be slide 9. Mm-hmm.
Okay, slide number 9, right? Okay.
Slide number 9.
All right, and I'll just make it full screen. All right. There you go.
Okay.
That's not it. That's slide number 1. There you go. So Hugh, what I did here is I broke down the allegations into 7 allegations, okay? So what bits don't we agree with? That was your question, right? What bits?
No.
So here's the first.
Which bits were lies as opposed to ignorance on his part? Well,
or and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Which parts were true? Maybe they're Maybe there's some true that we don't have to have this false equivalence that it's all false or it's all true. But let's just start with this. We've kind of had this discussion already. That is, he says that Robert D. Kalick, the Leary Dean, procured the image shroud for his own financial gain. So we've kind of had a discussion on here, but I believe that that's a falsehood. That it wasn't Robert D. Kalick who procured this image shroud for his financial gain. Now, in addition to the arguments that I've made before, let me just add one, because so many of these allegations, I want to come to this fact that, again, it seems to me it's always overlooked. Robert D. Kalick remained the dean of the Leary Church until his death. He died in 1358. Okay? Mm-hmm. So he was never, for any of the things that he allegedly did at Leary, he was never removed as dean. He was never defrocked. He was never disciplined in any way as far as we know. And so if you go through these allegations, though, all you have is a shopping list of all the bad things that Robert D. Kalick did and all the sins that he committed and all the church laws that he broke along the way. So if D'Arcy knows in 1389, in some way, that Robert D. Kalick actually procured a false relic and he did it for his own financial gain, what is Robert D. Kalick doing serving as the Leary Dean till 1358, and why, with him still serving in that capacity in June of 1357, why is a papal curia adding indulgences to the visitors that are visiting the Leary Church and thereby making more money for Robert D. Kalick's staff and himself during that period of time? This first allegation is just the first of several, but it's the first one that really strikes at you that it does not make sense. Either that D. Kalick procured the shroud, how would he afford to do it, what were the circumstances, let's speculate, and that he did so for his financial gain. That's a pretty serious charge. If he had ever sent this to the Pope, and the Pope said, we're going to have a hearing on your charges, how would D'Arcy prove this allegation, and why should Hugh Farey or anybody else believe in 2023 that this is true?
Yeah, no, I was only asking one question, which is, did D'Arcy know that Robert de Kalick had not procured the image shroud for his own financial gain? Was this a deliberate lie, or had he been misinformed?
I don't know. As I said, I'm willing to give D'Arcy maybe a little bit more slack than I think a lot of authenticists have given him. I will simply say this, that it was either a product of bad information that he got from God knows where, because he doesn't say it, or he did lie about it. And, I that's what I call a collateral attack on the allegations. I would rather deal with the substance of the allegations themselves, but we know that D'Arcy's objective in writing this memorandum and thinking about sending it, he sets forth his motivation. It's to end the exhibitions. That's what he says it's for. Now, why did he want to end the exhibitions? He says in the memo, because this is a scandal to the church and it's going to lead souls away from the church. He could have honestly believed that. That might be one of his motivations. But historically, these exhibitions, as they probably had in 1350, are taking money away from monies that could be contributed as his cathedral. There are now locals who might have attended his cathedral who are going to make the 12-mile trip or less down to Leary and see a shroud while they're down there and go through that. And there are all these pilgrims that, according to D'Arcy, are coming from all over the world. They're taking their contributions to Leary. At the same time, he's got a big problem with his cathedral. It's been hit by a tornado at one time, a hurricane, I think, a hurricane. It's been hit by lightning, even in 1389 when this document was put together. So it can't be denied that he had a financial motivation to lie. But, this is where a lot of these discussions go out of control. People are just allocating motives to other people. And I don't know, maybe D'Arcy deserves it because he's allocating a motive to Robert de Calac. He's saying that he was involved with the Shroud thing for his own financial gain. Where's his proof on that? He doesn't really have any proof. But if you didn't have that proof, would a decent person make that kind of an allegation against a fellow member of the clergy? And if you are going to make that allegation, why don't you show what the proof would be? Why doesn't D'Arcy say, I've spoken to so-and-so who was, with the Church of Troyes at that time, and, I've looked at records that they kept at that time. These are just flat out, bold-faced, unsubstantiated allegations, and they do have the effect, when you put them together, they have the effect of maybe saying, having Pope Clement say, this cloth has a lot of scandal attached to it. I am going to stop those exhibitions like the bishop wants.
But yes, so we think, but you've got lists and lists of all the things that D'Arcy got wrong. And I want to know if he was an out-and-out liar all the way through.
I would like to know that too, but does our case here on whether the Shroud, ultimately how this affects the Shroud and authenticity, that's always the elephant in the room. Does it matter whether he lied or was mistaken or he had good faith or bad faith? The only thing that really matters, this is where you go down the rabbit hole in Shroud history. The only thing that matters is that allegation true? Is it provable? Is it credible? And I think given what we know of the circumstances, it simply is not. And I actually think that is why D'Arcy never sent the memo to the Pope. The Pope wasn't going to get, in his dreams, in D'Arcy's dream, maybe the Pope was going to get this and shut down the showings. I don't think so. I think that the best he could have gotten is some kind of papal commission to look into what D'Arcy was charging. And at that point, they called D'Arcy in and they say, okay, you've made the serious allegations. Now, let's prove them. What is your proof for you to write that letter? And what is D'Arcy's proof? What did he have? What could he have? We don't know. So because of that reason, it just doesn't get any credibility.
But in spite of that, the Pope nevertheless decides that we must announce in a very loud voice that this is not the Shroud, and do away with all the trappings that it was surrounded with. So
yeah, I know that, and so your implication is it was because D'Arcy sent the memo and the Pope got the memo, and this goes back to the fallacy that was created by Chevalier. Chevalier knew, he was a very, very smart man. I think he may have been a lawyer, Teddy, but he was a very, very smart man. And he kind of evaluated the proof that he had. And he knew that this memorandum was just something that was found in the church records or the diocesan records, wherever they got it. They got it from the Bibliothèque Nationale, I believe. But he also knew there was not a papal record in which showing that Clement VII received it.
So why did Clement VII... why did Clement VII come up with this injunction then?
Well, I'll get to that. Let me just finish this thought, but I'll get to that. But it involves a bit of a story. But in any event, so Chevalier says, I know how I'm going to have people like Hugh Farey in the future make this equivalence. He puts on the document, without telling anybody that he's just doing, he puts end of 1389. That's how he dates the document. He doesn't tell anyone why he's putting the end of 1389. And actually, he has no factual basis to do it, because if you were just looking at the document, you would say, D'Arcy is talking about an event that happened on August 5th, and he's not talking about any events that happened after August 5th. It's obviously was written by him in August. And one other thing on that, Hugh, I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the D'Arcy Memorandum, D'Arcy says to the Pope, I hear that you've entered an injunction of perpetual silence against me, and I hear that you've threatened me with excommunication. I don't know if that's true because I haven't received the papers yet. So that further dates it that Pope Clement did this at the end of July, and whenever D'Arcy is writing this, he still hasn't gotten the confirming paperwork on this. But in any event, that was Chevalier's canard that he used. He just put this date, and then everybody that read it said, oh, this great churchman, historian, Chevalier, he's confirmed that this was written at the end of 1389. So that's exactly why Clement issued his bull and said, among other things, you now have to announce it's a representation in a loud voice. So let me get...
No, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to say I don't think de Charny ever sent that document at all. I just
D'Arcy, yeah.
D'Arcy. So, so why did Clement...
Yes, okay. Well, let me kind of at least explain where I'm coming from on this. Mm-hmm. I've got to go back to the 1350s, and I asked myself this question. In light of Canon 62,
yes,
and I think I have a slide on that, Dale. Canon 62. That would be...
Yeah, which slide?
it's from the fourth.
It's slide number 2.
Slide number 2.
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
And I'll make it full screen.
There we go. Got it. Yeah.
All right. So just kind of bear with me because I think that this answers Hugh's question. After the Crusaders took over Constantinople, they brought home a number of relics that they had stolen at that time. They got put into churches. The churches who featured them made a lot more money, had a lot more pilgrims. And then there was this demand for relics that supposedly came from Constantinople. And the nefarious out there produced these relics, and they're now all over Europe. And it's because of this that Pope Innocent III at the time, he says, we've got to do something about this. This is a scandal to the church. So he convenes the Fourth Lateran Council, and in 1215, the council passes this canon. This canon becomes church law. That's what a canon is. It's canonical law. So it becomes the law of the church. And it says, in the future, old relics may not be exhibited outside a vessel or exposed for sale, and that no one to presume to venerate publicly new relics, unless they have been approved by the Roman pontiff. In the future, prelates, that is, all clerics, Catholic clerics, shall not permit those who come to their church's causa venerationis for the purpose of veneration to be received by worthless fabrications, as has been done in the past. Now, this canon essentially resolved, and I'd invite you to let me know, Hugh, if you're aware. I haven't been able to find anything. I haven't been aware of a relic scandal after 1215. And the reason that this worked is that it put the primary onus here on prelates, because this scandal was really a matter of the churches acquiring these fabrications, then putting them in the church and having pilgrims come and make donations. And so from 1215 to, say, 1354, when the shroud appears in Liray, basically that type of relic fraud had been brought to an end. This canon stayed in effect until the Council of Trent, which I think was 1563. So this was applicable to both the first and second series of exhibitions of the shroud in the 14th century. Now, Geoffrey de Charny, or it doesn't matter, but the story that I'm telling, the version that makes sense to me, Geoffrey de Charny brings the shroud to Liray, intends to bring the shroud to Liray, and he is not going to violate this canon. And I think it was Mark Guskin in an earlier show, just more or less say, well, people break laws. People got a law against murder and people murder. Well, It's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is this is a church canon. It's specifically directed at clerics. And it's been in force and effect for all this time. Now, suddenly we have a awesome relic that there's a proposal that it be put up for veneration in a church. So it specifically refers to Canon 62. I'm just jumping ahead here just for a second to show you that when Geoffrey II wanted to have the second set of exhibitions, he applied. He applied to Clement VII through his legate for permission to do it. And when D'Arcy wrote his memorandum, he said to the Pope in this memorandum, please don't be too angry at me for continuing to harp on this subject of the shroud, because I'm compelled by Canon 62. He doesn't mention it, but he quotes it. I'm compelled by canon law to oppose worthless fabrications being brought into a church. So all these people who were involved knew about Canon 62. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're Geoffrey de Charnay and your record is you go to the Pope all the time. He goes to the Pope. He filed petitions for the Pope to use a portable altar when he was in the field. Everything he did with the Leary Church to establish it, to get indulgences for it, to have a cemetery next to it. These were all papal petitions that he filed, and he got approval. He is not going to show a shroud in the light of Canon 62 without getting papal permission. Now, I believe that he received this papal permission, and I don't have to get to the circumstantial evidence. I'll simply say in that letter that Bishop Henry sent to Geoffrey de Charnay in May of 1356, he recites in there, we have been informed, we being being him, we have been informed by legitimate documents that this divine cult has been approved canonically and ritually, meaning pursuant to canon, and the rituals that are being performed there have also been approved. So I believe that in the first set of exhibitions, they were done pursuant to papal authorization. Now, there's no bull that was issued. And I just want to say that the fact that a bull would not be found is not an unusual thing. I think that there were 70,000 bulls in the broader term, meaning letters, issued by the Avignon papacy, and they've been able to find 2,000 of them. So, finding a bull is not the easiest thing in the world. Secondly, the bull that Clement, that we know he issued, Clement VII, in July, I don't think that bull's been found. I don't think that we're quoting from the bull. I think we're quoting from the letter that he wrote. So, why would Innocent and then ultimately Clement handle it in this fashion? Well, behind everything that's going on, this is why I talk about historical context. There is, in 1354, the major issue for the papacy, major religious issue. I mean, they're involved in all sorts of civil issues like the Black Death and the war between England and France and whatever, but the major religious issue is church unification. This is the schism of the Western Catholic Church with the Eastern Church. It's been going on since 1054. It's 300 years old. And what very, very few people know is that there were back-channel negotiations going on at that time. What happened was the Byzantines had enough of the West, especially after the sack of Constantinople. But one of the Byzantine emperors, I think his name was Andronicus II, in 1328, he married a Catholic woman. He married Anna of Savoy. And she was raised a Catholic, and she had to kind of forswear her Catholic belief to become his wife. But he died 13 years later in 1341, and his son is now the emperor. He's only 9 years old, and he's being raised as a Catholic by his mother. And the mother is going to the Pope at that time, Clement VI, and saying, what can you do to help me out here and help out my son? And there are negotiations that go on in which the Pope, first Clement VI and then Innocent VI, who followed him, have said, we would like your help in bringing the Eastern Church back into the fold with the Western Church. And the emperor, the new child emperor, with his mother as his regent, he issues several bulls that basically say, I'll do it. I can get that done for you. But this is my price. You have to send men of arms and money to Constantinople, because we're on the verge of at any time being conquered by the Muslims, who are pretty much outside our gates. And both Clement and Innocent could not do anything at that time. The papal treasury was bare, and England and France, where they would usually get the money, they were at war, and they were spending all their money on the war at that time. So he had to leave it open. He had to leave that open. But it was always the great ambition of Innocent the Sixth and his successors, including Clement the Seventh, to make this deal with John the Fifth, the Emperor of Constantinople, because John stayed on the throne until about 1390. So he was still on the throne, and he had converted officially to Catholicism in about 1364. So here's what you have. If Pope Innocent were to say, I'm going to issue a papal bull, and I'm going to say that I'm allowing this veneration to happen because I find, through what Geoffrey de Beauharnais said to me and the proofs that he has made, I find that this was a venerated Byzantine relic. It's got as much provenance as those 22 relics that Louis has over there in the Sainte-Chapelle, those Byzantine relics. If I say that, what's going to happen is the emperor is going to demand that that relic be returned to Constantinople, because it was the position of the Byzantines that that relic, their suspicion was that that relic got pilfered in the sack of Constantinople by a crusader soldier, by a crusader clerk, something like that. And if Clement at that time said, I'm not going to order the return of that relic with you, if for no other reason is I can't put that relic in danger with the Muslims at your gate. I can't do that in good conscience. If he said that, then what would likely have happened is that John would say, well, then we're not talking about church unification anymore. I'm not going to help you on that issue of church unification that you want to talk about. And I don't want to get into it, but my own belief is that the shroud came to Geoffrey through King Louis IX, and that there was an issue of whether King Louis IX, in terms of acquiring the shroud, may have committed simony with the way that went down. Because Innocent could have simply said, and he would have learned this through Geoffrey de Beauharnais, he could have said to the Byzantine emperor, you have no right to this relic anyway. It was a prize of war. It went to the emperors of the French emperors of Constantinople. And just like the relics in the Sainte-Chapelle, they had every right to transfer them to another party. But if he had said that, he would have had to explain how Louis came into possession of the relic. That would have created a major issue with Louis, with the French church, with the French clergy, with the French people. So that's why I believe that the shroud was approved, the exhibition, in the 1350s. And it was the same situation when Clement had to approve the shroud exhibitions in 1389. Same situation, only he was in worse shape. By that time, the church was in schism in the West, and Clement VII was just the French pope sitting in Avignon, and there was now an Italian pope sitting in Rome, and they were going at each other, and they were competing with each other for predominance in the Catholic world. And so Clement was up against the fact that if he allowed, he couldn't announce that this was a Byzantine relic because he had the same problems as Innocent in doing so. But on top of it, if he just let it go, if he did what Innocent did, said, I'm just not going to issue a bull, then the Pope that was in Rome would say, who is this guy? We've got Canon 62, and he's ignoring the fact that this is being shown. So he issues a bull. But how does he not enrage the Byzantine emperor? He simply takes what probably Geoffrey de Beauharnais II said and said, this isn't a real relic. This is just a representation and a form of a relic. And he puts that in his bull, and he hopes that that's going to do the trick. But he does not tell the Leray clergy that they have to announce that it's a representation or a figure. And then the Leray clergy starts treating it like a relic. And D'Arcy complains about this in his memo. And in all likelihood, the emperor in Constantinople is saying that must be a real relic, and that must be our relic. We want this back. So the thing comes to a head, and that is where and why Clement, in his second bull, says, now I'm going to compel the clergy out there to announce in a loud voice that this is not the true shroud, it's a representation of the shroud. And he says, though, in his preamble, he says, I'm doing this because conditions have changed. I can't tell you what the conditions are. So what are the conditions that changed? I would say the conditions that changed were that the Byzantine emperor had now come in the midst of these potential negotiations to unify the church and had made some demands concerning that relic, and he had to make it perfectly, to satisfy him, he had to make it perfectly clear that the relic was just a representation. One last thing, the end of this story, which I don't think you ever tell, Hugh, and that is that bull that you're always citing was corrected. That's not the bull as it finally turned out to be. And here's what happened. That emperor, John, who had been emperor since 1341, he got deposed in April of 1390 by his grandson. So he's not there anymore. They can't unite the Catholic Church through him anymore. And so Clement goes to the bull that he had issued in January, and he corrects it. He changes it around. Now, he didn't change around the fact that they sometimes had to announce this representation thing in a loud voice, but he gave him a loophole. In the correction, he says, as long as you don't give a sermon, you don't have to make that announcement anymore. So what did they do? They stopped giving sermons, and they didn't announce anymore that it was a representation and a figure. And he says that prohibition about wearing all those nice church clothes and making it look like it's official, you can do that now.
All right, awesome.
Those are in the corrections to the January 6th bull. They are made at the end of May. And then he issues a third bull on June the 1st. And then the third bull, he increases the indulgences for people who are going to visit the shroud at that time.
Okay, so Jack, I'm just going to step in. Just we are at the 11:30 mark. This was Hugh's time to take the reins. So Hugh, I'm going to let you take a few minutes to get the last word if you want it, and then we'll go.
I'll just mention I've got other little bits and pieces. Yeah, I mean it's a fantastic story. It sounds great, and it could be plausible, but I just think there's no evidence for it whatsoever.
Do you think it's any more plausible than the cloth being gotten from Easter ceremonies that we're proposing?
I think it's less plausible than that. That the
in the Rhine's eye.
All about their relics. If they wanted any relics, they'd have demanded the crown of thorns and the true cross. They weren't particularly interested in the shroud.
Louis the King, who has it?
Yeah, it had virtually no important compared to the other relics. It was not very important to the Byzantines. It's hardly mentioned in lists of the Byzantine relics. It comes sort of 9th or 10th down. The top relics that if you're a Byzantine you want back would be the cross and the crown of thorns. We have no evidence that they considered asking for them at all.
Well, they didn't even reveal the shroud until about the year 1200. I mean, nobody even knows that the shroud. No one even knows that the shroud exists, other than there is a shroud, a sindon they make reference to, but no one knows it has a figure on the shroud itself.
I'm going to let you guys continue on. This is the informal discussion part, so continue on uninterrupted for about an hour or whatever you got, 40 minutes to an hour somewhere.
Right. Well, we'll see how it goes.
And just okay.
I want to bring in a couple more things, because there's something that I changed my mind over, which I didn't think I would. But It's those two little pilgrim badges.
Yes.
One of which, one's a badge and one's a mold. One was found in Paris and one was found just outside.
Right.
One of them has a big sign saying "swear" on the bottom of it, and that's the one that has the arms of Jean de Vergy in the prominent position, and the arms of the de Charnys in the less prominent position. And the one that was found in Paris doesn't have the word "swear" under it. It has the instruments of the Passion instead, and that one has the arms of de Charny in the prominent position and de Vergy in the lesser position.
Yeah.
Now, for a long time, it was thought that the one that was found in Paris and had the instruments of the Passion on it was preceded the second one, which has "swear" and the arms of the de Vergy family in the most prominent position. And I went for that, and my paper on academia has gone for that. But since then, I've changed my mind in the same way that Ian Wilson has changed his mind, and thinking that, in fact, the first one was the one that has the de Vergy arms in the prominent position and the word "swear," which suggests this is the shroud, written underneath it. So that would apply to the first set of exhibitions.
Why?
Because those are the ones.
Why do you believe that? Why do you put them in that chronological order? I heard you say that last program.
Those are the only ones we know where the shroud was actually displayed as a genuine relic. Whereas
I'm sorry.
Whereas
You think because it has the word "swear" on it that somebody thinks it's a genuine relic at that time?
Well, it was proclaimed. It was thought to be a genuine relic.
I do.
Well, we don't know. D'Arcy claims that it was thought to be, that it was exhibited as a genuine relic.
Oh, D'Arcy, yes, okay.
1450s, and we assume that he was. It could be another of his lies, that it was always proclaimed to be a fake. But if everybody claimed it was a fake all the time, then.
Well, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, Hugh. I know the whole story, of course, with the badges, and I know that Ian Wilson, who originated this, for I think between book 2 and book 3, between 1998 and 2010, he was arguing that I'll call it the Charny badge, the badge that has the Charny in provenance. He was arguing that took place. That was issued in conjunction with exhibitions while Charny was alive. And then I think when they initially found the Vergy badge, which came afterwards, the explanation was that Geoffrey de Charny died. The exhibitions continued on after his death for a little while, but they were the exhibitions which he had started. But during those exhibitions, his wife was now the head of the family. And so they issued the second badge. What historical or other evidence have you found that, I know why Wilson made the change. Simply, he said, because he couldn't figure out why Charny would have been silent about where he'd gotten the shroud. So he wanted to move the whole thing to after Charny's death. But what makes you think, what's the evidence in terms of the timing on the sequence that you're putting these two badges? Why aren't they exactly what they seem to be? And that is that the Charny badge is the badge issued during the Charny exhibitions while he was alive, and the Vergy badge is issued when she continues things. Why this story that there were badges for the second set of exhibitions, and suddenly Geoffrey Jr., who is married at the time to the niece of Henry de Poitiers, by the way, why isn't the badge Charny and Poitiers if it's a husband and wife? What is it in heraldry that has a badge issued between a son and the mother. I've never seen that justified in order to get to that story.
I've no idea, but
okay, speculation.
The hypothesis is, of course, that the first badge, but the second badge is a much higher quality badge, I may say, in terms of its artistic execution. But the second badge, of course, is found as far away as Paris, whereas the first one is just a mold, and it's.
I think they're both genuine. I don't think that's the story. But the one that was found in the second one was found in the ground in a village near Lirey. It could have been in the ground 30 years longer than.
Well, the second was only a mold, so it was almost certainly.
Oh, yeah, the mold was there, right?
Near the place where it was pertained to.
Yeah.
But the badge.
I think the pilgrim badges are too tenuous, other than to prove what they clearly prove, and that is that there were these exhibitions took place, and they were of the shroud, and the shroud is shown. I don't think they provide a chronology. When I first saw Wilson's claim that the second badge is now the first, and the first badge is now going to be assigned to 1389. I remember him saying he went to a couple of experts in heraldry, and they said, "Look, the best we can do is we can date both of them from let's say 1350 to 1400." But there's just no evidence of this. It's just this is the story, and this fits your story, so that's the story you're going to tell.
No, well, the only evidence, I know it's tenuous if you like, but I can't believe it's any more tenuous than your massive great story about the Byzantine emperors. But the fact that one of them has got Shroud written on it, and we know that the second exhibition, it was not being exhibited, at least formally, it was not being called the Shroud, and so by that time, perhaps the badge would be issued without the word Shroud written on it. Whereas,
but I mean,
that we think that
I would kind of agree with you that maybe somebody might have some reason for putting Shroud on it, but it's just not convincing that that dates it in any way.
Right. Now, can I just go back? So we've got your friend John V, was it?
Yes.
Closed in 1390. So we now need no longer pretend that the Shroud is a representation. Is that right?
No, because you would still, as soon as you're going to drop the story that it's a representation, then you're going to have to tell some other story and saying that it's real. It was a real Byzantine relic, and you're going to have to explain then how it got from Constantinople to Geoffrey de Charnay, and you come up with whatever little problem you would have in this. I think it's a major problem if you have to get into the Louis IX story. You may have a problem if you're going to say it was held by the Templars for a while, or it was held by the Cathars for a while. I mean, none of these stories are that particularly flattering about the history of the Shroud. So I think that number one, there was no reason at that point in time to worry about changing the representation, because he gave them the out. He said, just don't give a sermon anymore and you won't have to say it. So it's like a tree that fell in the forest and nobody knew it at that point,
Jack, just so you know, a lot of people in the audience are saying that your mic's a little bit too loud for them. If you could just
all right
a little bit. And going forward, just so I don't have to interrupt the debate, just make sure you're checking the private chat, and I'll leave messages for you guys.
I was not checking that.
Okay.
Me neither. Oh, yes.
Okay.
That way I can communicate with you without interrupting the debate and stuff. So,
right.
All right, cool. So continue on, and sorry to interrupt.
Yes. So, but in 1418, so what, 20, 30 years later, we still find that it is a representation. It's not the original. It's not a real relic.
Well, who's saying that, Hugh? I think the further you get out, the more irrelevant it becomes. But in 1417 or 1418, there's a contract. Yeah. The contract is between Margaret de Charnay, and the Leary canons. And so they're going to describe what this cloth is that Marguerite's husband is now going to take over. There's the last papal bull that had anything to do with this particular cloth says it should be called a representation or a form of the shroud. Why wouldn't those parties use those terms that the Pope has? And what does the fact of what any of those people at that time in 1417 really have to do with whether the shroud is authentic or not authentic?
Oh yeah, well, of course, there's always a possibility that everybody thought it was a fake, but they didn't know, and it was in fact real all along.
Yeah, right.
But to me.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that terminology. We've had a discussion now, a long discussion about why representation and form was used back in 1389, 1390. Why should two parties 20 years later working out a description of what's going to be held in trust by Margarita's husband, why shouldn't they use the words that the Pope used without them having any real significance? They know less than the Pope did at that time. You know, I just don't see that as a relevant.
No, well, I see this extraordinary convoluted web of deception. It's getting to be like the moon landings. So many people, either people thought that the shroud was authentic or they didn't think it was authentic. And it seems to me that nobody at all claimed that they thought the shroud was authentic. The popes didn't claim it was authentic. Geoffrey II didn't claim it was authentic.
I thought you said that D'Arcy. I thought you said that D'Arcy said that the first Leary Dean said it was authentic.
We've got nobody said that. It doesn't say that it was authentic.
He's complaining about the Leary Dean putting the word out that this is the actual shroud that Jesus was buried in. So he apparently thought it was authentic, or at least said that it was authentic.
Right. The only person to claim that the shroud was authentic, and again, if you don't trust anything D'Arcy said, perhaps he didn't, was the duplicitous Dean. And sure enough, the shroud was suppressed. Now, it might be suppressed as Geoffrey II claimed because of the marauding brigands, but the fact remains that when the shroud was proclaimed authentic, it was suppressed, and only when the shroud was not proclaimed as authentic was it permitted to be carried on.
So that shroud that they have in Turin now, do you think it's authentic?
No.
Okay. And I do. I think Teddy does. I think Dale does. So when the shroud was brought forward in Liray in the 1350s, how could any of those people know whether it was authentic or not? What Pope could possibly know that? Nobody. What is this obsession you have with whether people in the 1350s were saying it was or was not real, when in all likelihood they didn't know, but in their beliefs after seeing it, the ones who saw it, the ones who came and saw it, there were certain people who formed the opinion that it was real. Those pilgrims did not keep coming out to Liray because they didn't think it was real. You know, they thought it was real, and then they told other people and they came. So there were a number of people thought it was real. But what difference does that make in our debate? Are we just going to number how many people think it's real versus the people that don't think it's real? It doesn't get you to the resolution of the issue, does it?
No. Well, in that case, we can say that the whole of the correspondence around the turn of the 14th, 15th century is irrelevant to whether the shroud is actually real or not. We then have to go to other evidence, which would have to be entirely. Right.
I'm fine with throwing out the evidence of the late 14th century if it's there, because I don't think it really talks to it. But I think that we're here because, like as I understand how Dale approaches this, you as the non-authenticist have the burden of showing that the shroud is medieval, and you are coming forward, and it seems in a very reluctant manner, but you're coming forward to extol the D'Arcy Memorandum at that time. But I'm fine with throwing out the D'Arcy Memorandum. I don't think it really is that meaningful.
Oh, sorry, Dale. We've been here for hours, and we've decided that it's not really important after all. No, well,
we've shown the audience why it is not important.
Yeah, it's not
we've exploded that fraud, so to speak. Yeah,
I think both sides would. Well, no, the non-authenticist would certainly say that the correspondence regarding the exhibition in the 14th century is not the biggest arrow in the bow. It's just one of them.
Right. It's like that letter of Bishop Henry, which you came in last time and said, "Oh, I think he's referring to a Mary cult."
Yes.
But you know, and your evidence of that is the church is dedicated to Mary, but it's not really Mary. It's Mary, the Assumption of Mary, and it's also not just dedicated to Mary. It's also dedicated to the Trinity. I mean, so it's kind of got a dual dedication. But I don't see any evidence that when they dedicated churches in medieval times, you automatically then created a cult of the saint that you were dedicating the church to. In fact, Bishop Henry says, I want to develop a cult of this kind myself, right in the letter. And he's in the Cathedral of Troyes, which is dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul. So what does a Mary cult have to do with Saints Peter and Paul? And, you know, when... let me see if I...
What does the Shroud cult have to do with the Saints Peter and Paul?
Well, I just think that the Shroud cult, being as unusual is and attracting pilgrims from all over the world, according to D'Arcy, that's where you would want to develop one in your cathedral. You know, I don't know that you want to develop a cult of Mary when there's, you know, a dedication and people honoring Mary and there's churches to Mary all over the place. But there is a slide, if I could ask Dale to put this up. Let's see. Yes, slide number 8, Dale, if you could. That's it. So this is part of that letter. In fact, it's kind of a famous part of that letter that Pope Clement wrote to Geoffrey when he issued the first bull. And this is, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, that's not the right one. Hold on.
Just which one are we going down? Up one?
Yes, that's not, oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, it is number 8. Is that 8 you've got, Dale? Try that one.
That's the one that's on at the moment.
Yeah, that's the one that's on there. I have a different one. This one, Dale says, the quote, there it is. So this is Pope Clement in conjunction with issuing the bull in 1389. And he says to Geoffrey II, you have entrusted the shroud to the church, quote, to increase the devotion of the people and increase the divine cult. So this is a reference to, again, to the divine cult of Lyrae. So he is saying to Geoffrey, you're going to increase that divine cult by entrusting a shroud of Jesus to the church. How does that increase a Marian cult? It increases a cult of Jesus.
But,
and the other thing is it's a divine cult. It's Mary, the last time I looked at the church's holdings, Mary was not considered divine.
Have you got the Latin for that? Because he doesn't refer to the shroud, he refers to the representation of the shroud.
Okay, you haven't, that's my word. I'm willing to change that. You have entrusted the representation of the shroud. That's not the point.
Yeah.
But you've entrusted that cloth that's supposed to be a representation of Christ's shroud to the church. Here's the important point, to increase the devotion of the people and increase the divine cult. How is putting that cloth into that church going to increase a Mary cult, which he happens to call a divine cult, which that would be Jesus? But if it's going to increase the cult, whatever it is, it must have something to do with Jesus, right? Not Mary.
Well, yes, it must. I'm just a little.
Okay.
It certainly can't be the cult of a picture. So maybe it's I don't know.
It can be a cult of whatever the church is allowing to be exhibited out there, and because it's a representation of Jesus' shroud and a representation of Jesus on the shroud, the Pope is saying you can put it in there and you can increase the divine cult by doing it. I'm simply saying you came up with this.
What is it? Yes. Okay. So what is it a cult of?
Of the divine, and it's going to increase that cloth with an image of Jesus is going to increase that cult. How does that have to do with Mary?
This one doesn't. Well, not that I can see straight off.
Okay.
Anyway, all I can suggest is since he is showing a representation of the shroud, that we are looking at something like the cult of the Quem Queritis sort of resurrection liturgy.
You can see a statue or something like that, but the point is that these things are. This is at least a representation of a relic. If it was true, it would be a relic.
And representation, yes.
And in medieval times, there are many relic cults. I think Charles Freeman wrote a number of things about that.
This makes no sense as a relic cult.
Well, it makes maybe to you, but it makes every bit of sense to me.
In a single sentence, Pope says, "You've entrusted this picture to the shroud in order to increase the devotion to a relic," and I don't think that makes any sense.
No, it doesn't. He didn't say relic to increase the divine cult. In other words, increase the number of people who are coming to see it.
But coming to see a picture.
But instead of arguing against what I'm saying, what is your argument in favor of what you're saying? How does this help show that this is a Mary cult? What is your evidence for the fact that it's a Mary cult out there? You didn't have it last time around, and I don't see you having, and this just kind of complicates that showing further.
I don't know. I'd have to go back to the Latin, but this as it stands, the divine cult cannot be a relic cult. It could just be, a worship of God or something like that, or maybe the cult of the resurrection, and that may in fact be what Bishop Henry was referring to earlier on, possibly even the cult of the Trinity. I don't know.
Yeah,
but it cannot be a relic cult that this particular one is referring to.
Well, again, I would just listening to what you say, I would say, why can't it be a relic cult? I mean, it's easy to make, statements. It cannot be a relic cult. It must be a Mary cult. But what is it that supports that?
I'll waive the Mary cult, but it cannot be
a relic cult. Hey, I'm satisfied that you waived the Mary cult.
Because you can't increase a relic cult by installing a picture into your, if you haven't got a relic, by installing a picture into your church.
I'm not saying I agree with the logic of what the Pope is doing. I'm simply saying the Pope knew that he was approving this representation, and he said that he thought it was going to increase the cult. So I don't know what it is. I present to show that divine cult doesn't really pertain to Mary.
I'll have to try and work out what possible cult he could be referring to.
At least we've got that out there as a difference, whereas after the last program, it looked like, hey, you were pretty sure about that.
Yes, because looking at the Henry of Poitiers's letters, where there's no reference whatever to either the shroud or even a picture of the shroud. So the divine cult in those letters, I was just guessing that it must refer to the fact that the church itself was named after, was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and certainly there were Virgin Mary cults.
But
it's two different things from the two different bishops.
But he did mention a cult, so it was a cult of some kind. If it's not a Mary, what is it a cult of?
Do you guys? Sorry to interrupt. Teddy's asking if it would be okay with you guys if she just makes a very quick comment. Do you guys?
Sure, I could use a break.
Tell her it's not possible.
It's not possible. Okay.
We can try.
Teddy, you're muted.
Teddy, you're muted.
I was trying to be so good in my promise, but it's just too juicy. Okay, so with this whole divine cult, I wanted to bring in, and it's been mentioned before, the issue about Bishop Poitier's letter to Geoffrey I, how he was praising him. And the date of this letter was just 4 months or so before Geoffrey I was killed in battle. And he is praising him for cultivating this divine cult of this sort, which to me, the of this sort speaks volumes. Now, we get into the words divine and cult, and nowadays the word cult has all sorts of strange meanings that are nefarious, like some crazy cult. But in the traditional meaning of the word cult, it means worship. And of course, with the word divine, that means a worship of God. And here's this bishop who's praising Geoffrey I, and this wasn't years before. This was shortly before he died. So then there's a question of why, according to the D'Arcy memo, is allegedly Poitier being against Geoffrey I, which obviously he would have to if he was thinking that Geoffrey I was perpetrating a fraud on people with with a fake shroud of Christ. But to me, the only reason why you could call what was happening a divine cult is because to worship the shroud can only be done in a way that is consistent with the rules of Christianity. It's because Christ's blood is on there. It's not a representation. It's not a cloth. There is a piece of God that was in God's body that is on that cloth. And to me, that's the only reason why you can have a divine cult of this sort surrounding the shroud. And so to me, that's the reason why. Okay, now I'll be a good girl and I'll be quiet and wait till the.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks for that, Teddy. All right, back to you guys, kind of thing. So we still have about half an hour left as well for this portion. If you guys,
well, I think Jack would probably agree with me that the cult didn't usually mean just general worship. It was with reference to a particular facet of the divinity. So you could have a relic cult, which would involve, it wouldn't involve sort of total enslavement in the way that the word cult means now. I agree with that. But it would involve a special dedication to that particular facet, which might be a series of morning prayers or something like that, which enabled you to get perhaps indulgences for adhering to that cult. Would that be about right, Jack?
Yeah, I agree with that, Hugh. And I also think that that portion of that same letter that says the cult has been approved ritually and canonically, I think the mention of the word ritually, it means that whatever they're doing out there, it's a ritual, and it's not a normal ritual, something that's been in the church for years and years that no one questioned, but it's a new ritual of some kind that's going out there that's been approved. And so that, I think, was a lot of what the basis was for D'Arcy's objections, because he describes the rituals that were going on. Was even the pilgrim medallions show that two bishops are holding it up, and it does obviously involve the use of candles and that sort of thing. So again, a rather new ritual involving the shroud, which is kind of a new object of veneration, makes a lot more sense than some ritual being approved that's in connection with Mary devotion.
From the Henry de Poitiers mention of the word cult point of view, yes, I agree with that. From the Clement VII's mention of the cult point of view, it cannot refer to a relic because he says,
I agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
I agree with that. Yeah. Well, I agree that Clement VII, who's not allowing it to be called a relic, isn't going to say it's in connection with a relic. I am more focused on him saying that by putting this cloth in the church, it's going to increase whatever it's there. It's not increasing a relic. You don't increase the relic, but it is increasing the cult, which to me means the people who would come to that church to see that cloth and therefore venerate it in some way.
Yeah, and then yes, they'd be brought to a greater appreciation of the church in general. Yeah.
Yes.
Something like that.
All right, cool. All right, do you guys feel you've covered all the bases? Is there anything else that you guys want to discuss with each other?
Let me just.
I'm going to go back and research Latin again. The thing is, I just say that I do have a slight trouble that the lovely everything depends, of course, on Ulysse Chevalier, because all the documents are in his books. Now, whether he was right or wrong, or telling the truth, or he's misinterpreting them, the trouble is that he wrote 3 books, and they all have sources. The sources are not; they're slightly different sources in each one. I think he wrote one in 1900, one in 1903, and another one even earlier still, perhaps. And then each one as he moved to another section, lot of sources, he said that document A in this source is equivalent to document B in that source, and it all gets very confusing. Gotcha. So it's not easy to work your way around all these things, but so I do want to get back to them and have a look. And I mean, I was just trying to follow the one that the 1938, the 1338 bull, which I don't think I find, and I didn't. The only reference I can see, because all I've got with me at the moment is your book, and you give the reference as being Nicolotti's book, so I'll have to go and check.
What is the object? What is the object we're talking about, Hugh?
The letter granting indulgences to Leary in 1357 or 58.
Yeah, so, yeah, that is in Nicolotti's book, and Nicolatti is troubled by that. I mean,
I can imagine he would be. I'm troubled by my.
Yeah, he actually says, I think the other side is going to make much to do about this, but I'll give you my version. I think that after everything that happened in Leary, the papal curia just felt sorry for the Leary church and granted these indulgences. I mean, if you've seen in my book, I don't really think that's a very good explanation, especially when you realize that Dean Decalic is still alive. Maybe if he had done all this wrongdoing and he died, maybe a papal curia would say, well, we've got to give the Church of Leary a brand new start. But I don't see them granting these indulgences and helping the Church of Leary when he's still the dean out there, if all these things that are alleged by D'Arcy really happen.
It does sound strange. Do you happen to know if does Andrea quote the document, or does he just refer to it?
I just referred to it. I don't know that. Okay. I don't know that. I've never seen the document. I think I did get that from the reference made by.
I'll have to check later on, perhaps. Yeah.
Nicolatti. Yeah, but it is. I think you agree. You can see that it's a relevant document. It kind of fits in here, and it doesn't fit the non-authenticist point of view if you're trying to push the literal truth of the D'Arcy Memorandum. And we didn't have a chance to go through it, and I won't do it now, but had we gone through in each of those allegations to answer a question you asked at the beginning, Hugh, that is, what bits are true? I don't believe there's very much of the bits that are true. I mean, and by true, I mean accurate. They just kind of don't fit in. I do believe that D'Arcy gives us, it's only from him that we find out that there were pilgrims coming from all over the world.
Yeah. His idea of all over the world, perhaps we need to explore. I mean, I don't suppose there were many.
Well, he says, and not just France. So he is talking about some kind of foreign countries. And the other thing we really didn't cover, Dale, just as a document, that is in the, and I think this kind of somewhat explodes the non-authenticist case this way. Let me see if I can find the document real quick. Document number 1, Dale. I made it number 1 because it was so important. Okay, so this is back again to Pope Clement's letter, and he's talking to Geoffrey Jr., Geoffrey II, and this is what he says. He says, once your father, inflamed with the zeal of devotion, caused a certain figure or representation of the shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ, which had been freely given to him, to be placed for veneration in the Church of the Blessed Mary of Lire, which he himself founded. Now, this particular passage has been often quoted for the idea that Geoffrey owned the shroud and it had been freely given to him. And for purposes of our discussion today, that's certainly helpful for the authenticist case. Nick Audie has a problem dealing with this because it's not freely given to the dean. It got to Lire, according to the Pope, through Geoffrey de Charnay. But I thought was just as important as the final words. It says, Geoffrey placed it in the church for veneration. And so this is a historical record that I think Hugh put out a question at the last program. It was basically, if you didn't have the D'Arcy Memorandum, would you be able to make a history of the 1350s for the shroud? And you can. We did not do that today, but this is the first document. And so I don't need D'Arcy to tell me. We wouldn't wonder about it. We would see this letter and we would say, well, at some point, Geoffrey de Charnay, before 1356, before he died, he put the shroud in his church and he put it there for veneration. And that would seem, but in and of itself, to explode the allegation made by D'Arcy that this was done through the dean. And yet this is not quoted very often. And I'm not exactly sure why. But there it is. I mean, it's a document. It exists. It was written before D'Arcy's memo was written, as Hugh pointed out. Where did he get this information? He could have gotten it from Geoffrey. That's very possible. But he's also writing this. He's doing the bull ex certa scientia. So he says that he has other sources. Geoffrey's mother is the widow of not only Geoffrey de Charnay, but her husband, who was the Count of Geneva, I think, and he was Pope Clement's uncle. So I'm sure he knows Geoffrey's mother personally in some way. And by the way, her husband, the Pope's uncle, he died in 1388. He only died a year before these events transpired. So I think that he's got various sources. He's also got his papal curia, to the extent that that's left over from Innocent's reign and whatever documents might be around there. So I don't think he's getting this information solely or strictly from Geoffrey. And if he's putting it out there in this way, I think he knows that there were these earlier exhibitions in Lire. I don't think we need D'Arcy to tell us that.
Fair enough. Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, awesome. So cool. If you guys are done with this portion of the debate, I can turn it to Teddy for the cross-examination phase. You guys both happy to do that, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Look. All right, cool. So Teddy, I'm going to have you for the next 10 minutes or so do a cross-examination of Jack. And again, pay attention to the private chat. I'll alert you at the 10-minute mark, and then you can wrap up, kind of thing.
And let me ask you, because instead of it really being a cross-examination, there are just some issues that I'd like to bring up, and I'm really interested in hearing what both Jack and Hugh have to say about it. It's not necessarily that I'm trying to grill anybody on anything, but do you mind if I kind of do it a little bit more that way?
Sure. This is your time.
Okay. All right. So one of the things, and I'm a little bit in disagreement with you, Jack, on the issue of the D'Arcy memo not being important. I get what you're saying by that in terms of because you don't think it's true, and I agree with that sentiment. But my opinion is that I think that it's extremely important that we get to the bottom of it because skeptics like to use the radiocarbon dating, which gave a medieval date, and the D'Arcy memo in conjunction to corroborate each other. And then it's like, aha, see, these two pieces of independent evidence are showing or evidencing that the shroud has a medieval date. Now, that's a pretty big bombshell, and I acknowledge that. That's a huge bombshell, especially that the D'Arcy memo is coming from a bishop, that supposedly wrote it. That's a secondary issue that I want to get into, but so then to me it becomes, and as you've been doing, it becomes a question of, are the claims contained in the D'Arcy memo true or not? And that's what it all revolves around. Is it true? If they're true, well then, wow, that's a big problem for authenticists. But if it's false, then that's a real big problem, in terms of that takes away this huge dagger that skeptics use against the shroud's authenticity. And so, but anyway, no, this question's a little bit more for Hugh. Whether the claim in the D'Arcy memo is that Poitier discovered that there was this artist that created this cloth that we now have in the Shroud of Turin. And when we take away all of the claims and all of the chatter, and as the scientists like to say, we separate the signal from the noise, what it really boils down to is, okay, we've got the cloth. What evidence is there that this thing can be created by human hands? And all of the scientific evidence has been that nobody's been able, many people have tried, but nobody's been able to recreate a cloth with all of these special images that or aspects of it that we know it has. So you talk about this what's it called? Queritas,
yes.
Queritas, cloth that you think that this was, created by human hands, and you believe, am I correct, that you believe that this cloth that has been created by human hands for this ceremony, that is what we have in Turin? Is that correct?
Yes. Well, the word believe is a very strong word, but I am of that opinion at the moment, yes.
But then, how is it created so that Muller and Adler and Rogers and with Larry Schwalbe's, with the X-ray fluorescent, how, with all of that evidence, how is it that this thing has been created when nobody can recreate it? Nobody sees any signs of, it's dehydrated and oxidized cellulose that's created the image.
Can I tell you a story which happened to me about a week ago?
Certainly.
I was talking about the shroud amongst some ladies in a tea party, and they asked exactly this question. They said, why hasn't anybody done it? And because it was a tea party, there was a cake tin, a metal cake tin. So I said, well, in this tin, there's a cake. Can you reproduce it for me? You're all cooks. And they went, yeah, let's have it. Let's have a look. I said, you can't open the tin. You can't look at it, but I can show you a photograph of it. And they went, well, how? We don't know what kind of cake it is. Oh, wait a minute. I said, I've also got 3 crumbs. And they said, oh, can we have a look at those? I said, no, but you can look at the description of the 3 crumbs. Now, can you make an exact copy of this cake? And they went, well, no, of course not. We want to look at it and take a slice and have a look, see how thick the icing is and all the rest of it. I said, sorry, you can't do that. And I think the people who are those people who have tried to make copies of the shroud are trying to, on very, very limited evidence of the kind that a person who tried to copy something would want to have in front of them. If somebody was asked to make a perfect copy of the Mona Lisa or some marble statue, they'd want to go up to the Mona Lisa or the marble statue and dig around with it with their own investigation. It'd be no use asking, they would feel less confident that they had to follow exactly the findings of a bunch of nuclear physicists.
But we know, for example, with the information that we've gotten from Stirp's investigation, we do have a lot of information in terms of what the shroud image is and what it is not, and what the blood images are and what the body images are. I mean, we know that it cannot have been created through iron oxide.
No, we don't. No, the shroud's covered in iron oxide. What we don't know is what we don't think there's not enough iron oxide to produce an image. But maybe there was a lot of iron oxide and now it's been washed off. We don't know whether the shroud's been washed or not.
Well, okay, and that was something you had mentioned. That was something you had mentioned before with regard to this ceremonial quem queritas. You were talking about maybe the image had gotten washed off, but the shroud has been in the fire of 1532 where it was doused with water, yet the image has not been washed. So what were you talking about?
The paint was probably washed off before that.
But where is there evidence of paint creating an image? I mean, we know that
the paint's not very well distributed across the shroud. The variation in the amount of iron oxide found in various parts of the shroud is much, much greater than the variation in, say, the calcium, which is found fairly evenly all over the shroud.
Iron, calcium, and strontium is very evenly spread throughout
Well, the calcium and strontium is quite evenly spread amongst the shroud. The standard deviation between the quantities of iron and calcium and strontium measured is a very small percentage of the average, whereas the iron oxide, the standard deviation of the iron oxide, is a very large percentage of the average, showing that the distribution of the iron oxide is much more uneven than the distribution of the calcium.
Well, all I know is that there wasn't a correlation between iron of any sort and the image.
Well, you don't know that, do you? You think that.
Well, no, the X-ray fluorescence and the X-ray radiography, but I'm getting a thing from Dale.
Focus on the history.
Talk about the history. Okay,
Yeah.
well.
And don't forget to include Jack as well. So yeah.
Oh yes. But in terms of with the that gets the
anyway. Yes. So we don't know how it was made, and that's fair enough.
Because I mean, the thing is that if you can't account and given that nobody's been able to recreate the shroud, why we have gone through this extraordinary effort to create something for some ceremony at a little church?
Not a little church. No, it's 4 meters long. That's the length of the altar. So it's a big church.
Okay, so it's a big church, but
Yep.
but how? What's the likelihood that somebody created something back then that people nowadays are just clueless in terms of trying to recreate, and especially something that has,
When it was first exhibited in Leary, let alone anywhere that it might have been beforehand, and then later on when it was exhibited in Mons, perhaps Jack might remember this, or Liège up in Belgium,
Mhm.
where that chap Zentflight commented on it. The comments that there were how bright and clear it was. Now, are they? It's just possible that they were deluding themselves in that they were so surprised to see any image at all that they called it bright and clear. But they definitely said that it was bright and clear, which is not something that people usually say about the Shroud today. And that suggests that something's happened to it in between it being exhibited in Belgium by Margaret de Charny and how we see it today.
Wasn't the question about Adler in terms of preserving the shroud, that he was concerned that the back of the image would, with age, become darker to where the body image then would not show as much contrast?
Yes, I think he was very worried about that.
So, I mean, that could potentially be why the shroud was a little bit more noticeable, because maybe the background of the cloth had not darkened.
I don't think so. It's not very dark even today.
Right. Okay, let me get on to
one thing I just want to throw in here, just to give Jack a little bit, because he also, I remember you talking to me privately about the size of how small Leary was. So I just wanted to give you a chance, like, the population of Leary, does that have any impact?
Well, I think that when we get back to this question of cult, and if you consider that today the population of Leary, I think I looked it up recently, it's about 108 people. And back at the times that we're talking about, I doubt that it had much more than Geoffrey de Charny and his family, the Leary canons, and a few people. You might have had maybe 10 households or something like that, but you're talking about a very, very small group of people. And that just gets back to what you and I were discussing before, the idea of a reference to a cult. If it was a cult of Mary, if that's all you were talking about in the vacuum at a time when the shroud has not even been shown there as yet, I don't see Bishop Henry referring in the sense of a cult being a group of people to the people who would be at Leary. It makes more sense if he's referring it in the terms of cult being a worship, the type of worship that's going on in Leary. But since Hugh has come around a bit on the claim that it was a Mary cult to begin with, I think I'm just taking Coles to Newcastle here.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So sorry about that, Teddy. You have about 5 minutes to cross-examine, and then I have 5 minutes.
I was wanting to get into and first to deliver a warning to anybody reading the English translation delivered by Thurston. That is an extremely deceptive document. I mean, in terms of how he eliminated the heading, which showed that it was not a formalized document. And there's been, I think Jack has written about, or was it you, Jack, that's written about how it's like a Frankenstein document where these two drafts,
right,
the alleged D'Arcy memo, have been put together and manipulated. Also, I want to point out, for example, because everybody talks about how the D'Arcy memo, there's this cunningly painted image done by an artist that was discovered and all this. Well, okay, we look at, that's Thurston's translation, cunningly painted. Well, when we look at the Latin for that, the word is, I'm probably going to butcher the word, artificios. And that can mean, of course, like it sounds like in English, artificial as opposed to natural. It can also mean skillfully or artistically painted. So for all we know, this could have just been one of the over 52 documented copies of the shroud that was painted by somebody. But it doesn't say anything about cunningly painted. And then this whole Herbert Thurston uses the term that the artist painted it using a clever sleight of hand. Well, okay, that's a pretty nefarious sounding thing to write, except the Latin says in quo subtili modo depicta, which subtili, even to the English, subtle, which of course, instead of clever sleight of hand, that can just mean a simple depiction or a subtle depiction. So, you know,
no. Subtilis had a very specific meaning in Latin, as indeed it did in medieval English.
Well, not according to the dictionary that I got these definitions.
Well, no, what it means now is different from what it meant in Shakespearean times and in the 14th century. It means underhand.
Well, I think we know that words can often have more than one meaning.
Yes, but throughout in the Bible, for example, the devil is called subtle, subtilis, all the time.
I mean,
it doesn't mean in that case simple.
I know, but I don't think that back then
it definitely means crafty.
I don't know that words back then were just limited to one definition. Language is pretty rich. Anyway, my point is just that people need to be careful with reading the Thurston English translation and look up, because I found that a lot of those words can have multiple meanings, some of which seem very nefarious and some which do not. I'm curious, do y'all think that D'Arcy even really wrote this memo, or was it written by, I mean, because when Chevalier, there was, well, we know that there was a refined draft of the memo, and then there was a draft of the memo that was heavily marked up. But the refined draft of the memo, on the back of it, has the name of Guillaume Fulcois, Fulcois, who is the one presumably who wrote it. Now, was this man a scribe where he was just maybe transcribing what Bishop D'Arcy was telling him to write? Or, for example, I was a judicial law clerk, and many times I was given the task of, okay, look over this and write an opinion, and then I give that to the judge, and the judge decides whether if he likes it, he'll just sign off on it, and if he doesn't, he might make changes. Or, you know, of course, I've never had one just totally trashed, but you know, it could very well be, given this name that's on the back, that D'Arcy may have never even written this. And we don't know whether he would have endorsed everything that was being said in supposedly his name. So I'm curious. What do y'all think about this?
How did you spell his name again?
Fulcois, Fulcois, and the first name is Guillaume, Guillaume, and his name was on the back of the refined draft of the memo, of the two memos. And, you know, people frequently say, oh, it was likely a scribe. But I mean, a scribe usually is copying, you know, like here's a piece of work, and then a scribe is making multiple copies. So I'm wondering.
This is a different kind of scribe, Teddy. I think they're referring to this. These documents were discovered by Hilda Leinen back around 1993, and I think she's the one that did the assessment that this was a scribe. I don't know whether she actually found this man in history, but her explanation was, and it makes perfect sense, that what would happen, especially if you were writing to a pope, there were these scribes who were expert in turning what you're saying to a pope into all the formalities that you would have to put before the pope. For example, in the first version you're talking about, it kind of starts out and he doesn't have it like, your holiness, scraping before you on my knees and giving you all due obeisance and things like that. There were these kind of things that had to be put in these kind of communications. So why it looks like it did not go to the Pope, and even Nicolati, after he goes through all the arguments, the most convincing arguments of why it did, he ends up conceding that there's no definite proof that it went to the Pope. If you look at that endorsement that has, it basically says, this is the story of the cloth of Liray, which I intend to write to His Holiness the Pope. Now, why does a person prepare a document and then put that as the caption? Is he reminding himself that he intends to send this to the Pope? What happens is that if he decides to send this, he's not going to send it directly to the Pope. He's going to send it to one of these scribes who are experts then at turning these documents into formal church documents with all of the things that are required. So the combination of him saying, I intend to send it, and the name of this man, it's the message he would be sending to the scribe. He'd be saying, this is the letter that I intend to send to the Pope. Here, you take care of it, and do what has to be done to it. In his rough draft, the second draft that was marked up, where he's got marginal notes that say vacat, vacate this, that, and the other thing, it's clear that this is something that he's marking up. He's bracketing terms that he thinks might be too offensive to the Pope. But we get the D'Arcy Memorandum. The form that we get of it is basically the clean copy that is there, but it still tells itself to be something that is only intended to be sent to them. And if he does intend to send it to him, this is probably the name of the scribe that he is going to use to formalize it for the Pope's review.
Gotcha. So you're saying that the scribe is more to just kind of fancy up the paperwork so that it's ready to be.
At all the salutations, there are these terms. It has to have an initialo, but it has to have a formal greeting. It has to have the name of the addressee. It has to be dated. It has to have the sign off, all this. And you can see that the D'Arcy memo is kind of the sum and substance of what he wants to say to the Pope on the substantive matters, but it's not all the floral things that would be put into it before it would reach the Pope. There's a lot of backside kissing that has to be done in these communications.
Awesome. All right, cool. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn it. We have 3 audience questions. So I just want to make sure we fit those in. And
can I get one big thing that's like really, really big?
One quick thing. Okay. All right, cool. One last quick thing.
Right.
So we go ahead. But
okay. This has to do with something that I found to be very telling. I'm always fascinated by psychology and psychological reasons why people do or do not do things. And I find it very interesting that in the D'Arcy memo, let's just assume it's a given that D'Arcy did in fact write it. He talks about how he was being told by others that he, D'Arcy, was being made to look like a laughing stock by allowing the abuse, meaning the display of the shroud in the Leary Church, to continue. And so I think that's an important factor to consider, that there were a lot of pressures, social pressures on D'Arcy, and especially if you take into account that D'Arcy firmly believed that this could not be the shroud of Christ, not based on what he was seeing, but just because the Gospels, in his mind, obviously wasn't interpreting Galatians 3:1 as Jack and I do, that there is a reference to it. But, he believes that this cannot exist. And so I mean, I think that actually maybe his heart was pure in the sense that he thought he was doing right by trying to stop what he thought was a fake from being worshipped in this divine cult of this sort, you know, where people are because if you believe that that's really Christ's blood, then I think you can technically worship it because it's part of God. But so it's just interesting to me. And then the pulling back, the not having sent it. Now, did he not send it because he was threatened with excommunication? Or did he not send it because this was when Jeffrey D'Arcy was having this shroud displayed in the Leary Church? That was only 34 or so years ago. So there were still likely people who would have known back then if there was all this hubbub about this artist and this fraud, I mean, there's no evidence of these investigations that D'Arcy references in his memo. He's talking about, oh, there were all these investigations, but there's no evidence of this. Yet if D'Arcy had published this letter and sent it, then there's the question of whether witnesses who were still alive back then 34 years ago, some people who might have been in their 70s or 80s might have said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't true. There weren't any investigations. And so, you know, I'm curious, you know, what do y'all think in terms of just the potential psychological motivations that may have been going on with D'Arcy and why he did or did not do what he did?
Well, I don't think D'Arcy sent the letter because he was under a sentence of perpetual silence. That memo itself is a violation of perpetual silence in its strictest sense. The Pope had told him, you are not to speak anymore about this matter. And here he is sitting down and he's writing about this matter and in far more detail than he ever said it before. I think you know, Teddy, that if you're under a court order, before you violate that order, you have to go and have the motion, you have to file a motion to have it vacated or modified. And that's what D'Arcy's petition to the Pope should have been. Please modify the sentence of perpetual silence so I can write you on this.
Well,
instead,
could maybe have D'Arcy written this before he received the notice to be?
No, he says in the memo, I understand that you have issued an excommunication against me if I violate this silence. So he knows that. And so he's, he's proceeding at his risk. And ultimately, it's the major reason why I don't think he sent this off. I think he was right on the edge through what he had done up to that time of being removed as bishop. And, he wasn't going to do that at the time. I don't think that he would have been concerned about being embarrassed, because once the bull was issued, and if people came and said, why are you allowing this to happen in Liray, he would simply say, the Pope has ordered it. There's a papal bull. There's nothing I can do about it now. So I don't know, that he would have any kind of reluctance or embarrassment about it.
Interesting.
And I think you were sort of arguing against yourself with this, the inquiry of Bishop Henry, because you first of all said, well, we've got absolutely no records of the inquiry, which is perfectly true, but then we haven't got records of many things. But then you said, well, surely there would be people who remember the records and they would have spoken out. And the answer is, well,
just that there was an inquiry.
Yes, if there was an inquiry, they would have spoken out, and they didn't. But then why should they? If they agreed with D'Arcy, there would be no reason for them to speak out.
But they never saw D'Arcy's memo or his letter.
No. I mean, I don't think it was. It doesn't mean that there was or there wasn't.
But I mean, they might have come out of the woodworks had they seen that D'Arcy was making a claim that there were these investigations.
You mean they might have come out? They might have come out and said, no, there wasn't.
Well, I mean, we don't know. I mean,
no, we don't know. I mean, that's the thing. So
that could be a reason why he didn't ever make it public.
I think we should keep in mind that D'Arcy was a lawyer before he was ever a priest. That was his background. And, if you're a lawyer and you're going to make out a case, which is basically what his memo was, to make out a case to the Pope, you're going to invoke the evidence that you have. You're not just going to make bold, unsupported charges. And so this is the great mystery about it. If there was a council held or there was an investigation, he could point to a single witness, a single advisor who was a part of that, and say, if you need any further proof, you can call on, this great man of the law or this great theological advisor that happened at the time. It's one of the things that damages the veracity, the credibility and veracity of that memorandum, especially coming from a lawyer, somebody who practiced law before he was in.
Probably even back then, they may have had the rule where there's what we call hearsay within hearsay, because D'Arcy is saying that Poitiers said that an artist who's not even named said. So you've got double hearsay.
Well, it's doubtful he ever spoke to Poitiers, because Poitiers died in 1370, and D'Arcy came to Troyes in 1373. So it's kind of doubtful that he talked to Poitiers, which would make it double hearsay. So you're probably into at least triple or quadruple hearsay in terms of what somebody heard somebody say.
Probably
and
based on nothing but sheer rumor.
Yeah, I mean, that's giving him the benefit of the doubt that he actually heard this and people actually said it. But there's also the possibility that he made it up out of whole cloth or he exaggerated. We just don't know. That's why I think you have to do what we tried to do a little bit here today, and that is look at the substantive veracity of what he's saying as opposed to the surrounding circumstances. When it gets to the surrounding circumstances, we're making a lot of guesses and suppositions, and we're trying to bring historical context to that. But I think that the language itself in the memo leaves itself open to a lot of attack.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, I do want to get to the audience because I let that go on a little bit longer because this is relevant, and a couple of questions aren't really relevant to today's topic. But the first one is, and this one comes from our mutual friend, Joe Marino. So he says, Hugh emphasized the opinions when the shroud historically surfaced. What about subsequent actions by popes? Over 30 popes have spoken in favor of the shroud. Does this not count for anything? So we'll start with Hugh and then we'll get Jack's take.
I suppose, in a word, no. And this would be following Jack's argument, really, is that whether a person thinks the shroud was real or not doesn't necessarily provide evidence for whether it is real or not. And we've been talking about the whole of the correspondence around the 13th, 14th century, 14th, 15th century, as if these people, some people said it was real, some people said it wasn't. Well, they didn't actually know whether it was real or not because they were simple chaps without spectrometers. And in fact, none of the 30 popes have had spectrometers either. I think Jack probably agree with that.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because I do agree with that. Again, focusing on that question that Joe raises here, he says, does this not count for anything? I think he's saying, does it not count for something in proving authenticity? And I really don't think that it does. I mean, I guess I could say if I was a non-authenticist, we've had some recent popes here who don't want to call it a relic. They want to call it an icon. Does that mean anything in terms of what? All it really tells you is what their opinions are based on the information that they're processing, just like we're processing information. And if we're going to do a historical analysis, then all we can do is kind of look at what the historical records tell us, and even what we've been discussing today when it comes to the opinions that people hold about the shroud's authenticity. I think they mean kind of next to nothing, in my opinion. However, if they act, if a pope is allowing the shroud to be venerated, if the pope is approving rituals that are accorded to relics, then I think we find out that perhaps that Pope or that bishop had a belief at that time that the shroud was real. But we don't know that today with all the scientific equipment we have. How in the world did these people really know about it in the 1340s, 50s, 80s? No way.
One of the things is that not all opinions are equal, and we have to remember that with Pope Clement, he was the nephew of Robert de Geneva, or was that his name? He was the nephew of the guy that was married, the man that was married to Jean de Vergy, so Jeffrey's mother. So, I mean, I would be really shocked if Pope Clement had not personally seen the shroud for himself. Now, if he hadn't, he was probably at least getting very reliable communications from his uncle that it was very much describing it and having his uncle affirm the authenticity of it. So I mean, many popes may have said things about it, but I think that the anti-Pope Clement had some, I think, probably very good knowledge about the cloth itself from people who were, having it in their possession.
I think we do have to make a distinction between his having information about the first series of shroud exhibitions, which I think he did through those sources you're talking about. I take Joe's question here as answering, can we know anything through the opinions that these people hold on authenticity? And I don't think Geoffrey de Charnay's widow, if she held an opinion on authenticity, it mattered. I don't think if her husband thought it was authentic, it mattered. He could be right or wrong. And I think all this knowledge that Pope Clement VII is hiding under his Excerpta Scientia ruling, I don't think he's hiding some secret knowledge that the shroud is authentic. I don't think any of us have that secret knowledge at this time. This is what the debate is entirely about. But and I'm just sorry, I guess I've lived a lifetime in which maybe certain people's opinions are more informed than other people. But I would want to know what makes them more informed. If my information is not what I know myself, but I'm getting it because I know a relative or somebody is going to tell me something, that doesn't make me believe that it's any more authentic. That's why I said at the get-go that I think that this discussion isn't necessarily going to take us so far to the issue of authenticity itself. But I think that it helps to know how people were treating things at the time. And I'd just like to make one last kind of correction, if it is. In terms of what I said, Teddy, about the importance of the D'Arcy memo, that was in the context of my saying that Hugh has the burden of proof on this issue of it being a medieval object, and that I think for his case, it's kind of meaningless. I think it has been rendered meaningless. I do think that it has a lot of meaning in the history of the shroud, and I think we tried today to show how in some ways it helps prove the authenticity of the shroud. But I think it's getting more and more irrelevant to the case that non-authenticists like Hugh are to make their case for non-authenticity. I think they are pushed much more over to the scientific side and the carbon dating than the history.
Ultimately, science is what tells you whether the claim in the D'Arcy memo can be true. If it's a painting, or if you want to say some other type of artwork not using paint, but you have to show that it can be done. Because if all of these people have attempted to recreate it and they fail, which that's been the case so far, then we have no basis to think that it can be recreated.
Okay. All right. Okay. In the interest of time, and because the other questions aren't related to today's topics, I'm just going to skip those for the time being, and I'm going to just turn it to the two debaters. This is about your guys' views on the medieval documents, and maybe 3 to 5 minute kind of closing statements. And we started first with Hugh, so Hugh will get the last word. So Jack, we'll start with you for a quick closing word.
Okay. Well, I like to believe that this exercise has been productive in some way, has some kind of meaning. I don't really think that if you approach the subject from a somewhat academic standpoint, that Hugh and I are really that far apart when it really comes to a lot of things. But we're human beings, and our personal beliefs on authenticity sometimes drive, I think, what we're saying and how we view things. I look at this evidence from this era as more or less proving that the shroud came into Lire from Geoffrey de Charnay, and that there's a perfectly logical historical explanation for why and how Geoffrey de Charnay got the shroud. And almost all these 13 hypotheses that have been written in the last 120 years, they all connect the shroud to the shroud of Constantinople. And that kind of takes the Leary shroud in the vacuum that the non-authenticists would bring it as a creature of the Leary days. It takes it back to Constantinople. And then you'd have to look beyond that. How long had it been in Constantinople? Where did it come from? And there is a path. You can choose whatever path you wish to choose. The one that I proposed, the one that Ian Wilson has proposed, bits and pieces of either or both, something else. And then that shroud can be taken back to the 1st century, all the way back to this conversation we had on Galatians. And there is an argument then to be made, a historical argument to be made for the shroud being authentic and being the real shroud of Jesus. As I said, I think the non-authenticists, for now, have the high ground on the science because they've got this scientific test. And then it's a matter of opinion whether any of these things that have been put out adequately discredit, either individually or cumulatively discredit that, or whether someone like Bob Rucker has come up with a perfectly reasonable, if not provable, theory of why the tests could be off. But that's kind of where it takes us, and I'm just hoping that this is not. I've said this a number of times, a number of conferences I appeared at. It's been my attitude about this. We find people on both sides of this issue kind of spitting at each other all the time, and they're critical of each other all the time. They look down sometimes at each other. I think I could learn more about this subject than I do by talking to someone like Hugh Farey, because I think he does his homework, and he has his opinions, and you can see from the show, as far as I'm concerned, he can modify his opinions. If you give him some evidence that he hasn't considered before, he can modify his opinions. And I can tell you, if he put something before me, I might modify my opinions. And then maybe there's a chance then of a better chance of getting to the truth, which hopefully is what we're all trying to get to in the end.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right, Hugh, you get the last word for today. Go ahead and give your 3 to 5 minute closing.
Well, I'd like to say that this is the kind of debate that I really enjoy, because I'm talking to people who can not only assess the evidence that I think I've got, but I've also got a whole list of things that I've now got to go up and check for myself. I think one of the things that I'm very happy to hold is that I'm of the opinion that the evidence sways me to think that the shroud is medieval, and I'm not taken in by the adventures of the Byzantine emperors. But I shall go back to study the life of John V, which I didn't know a lot about until Jack introduced him. I shall spend a lot of time trying to track down, probably via Andrea himself, who's a man I correspond with quite a lot, that that bull of 1357 about the extra indulgences, I shall try and find out a little bit more about Robert de Caillac. I've already been working on the life of D'Arcy, who was a local to Troy all his life, and was so would have known about the adventures in Leary, at least as a young man, if not as a child. So these things are all extra evidence, and Jack's right. I might suddenly go, well, that's an absolute stumper, and I'm forced to change my mind.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. It is what the Shroud Wars is all about, progressing towards truth and getting into those details and stuff. So thank you so much to Jack, Hugh, and Teddy for coming on and contributing. I hope you guys enjoyed it on your end.
Thank you.
Did very much. Yep.
Awesome. Cool. And as I always say, you guys are always welcome back anytime for any topics and stuff like that. But just for the audience, what I have coming up tomorrow, again, as a live show, it's another Shroud Wars show. Michael Kowalski, the head of the British, the BSTS newsletter there, will be on tomorrow. And he's got new findings and information related to the carbon-14 dating and looking a lot at the politics around the carbon-14, which is something that I, apart from a show with Joe Marino, I don't really focus on the politics. So that's something that's crucially important to consider as well, I think. So yeah, that's what we have coming up, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dale.
Thanks for letting us in.
Nice talking with y'all.